we examine some of the most interesting visual works of art that were inspired by the horrors of the Black Death. Even as large-scale projects like the expansion of the cathedral in Siena had to be abandoned because of the death of most of the designers and skilled laborers, other works of art flourished, especially those that could be conceived of and executed by a few people or a single individual. Through trancy tombs, paintings, and woodcuts of the Danse Macabre, the motifs of the three living meet the three dead, and the triumph of death, artists explored the memento mori tradition. Remember, you're going to die. We're going to talk about how some of the greatest literature the world has ever produced came into existence as a direct result of the plague. If ever there was a silver lining to be found, the fact the Black Death gave writers like Giovanni Boccaccio and Geoffrey Chaucer the opportunity to create works of art that are still considered masterpieces today is it. But let's start this lecture with a more predictable and less exciting literary response to the plague: medical tracts. In the midst of the first wave, those who practiced medicine were pressed into service to try and explain what was happening. You'll recall that the King of France commissioned the medical faculty of the University of Paris to write a concilium, or medical treatise, that would explain where the plague had come from, steps that might be taken to avoid infection, and options for treating the sick. This treatise spent a great deal of time explaining how the conjunction of Mars, Saturn, and Jupiter were to blame, as were the weather and the occurrence of several earthquakes. And you'll also remember that diagnosis and treatment were based on Galenic medicine, named for the Greek physician Galen, who lived in the 2nd century. Galen theorized that the health of an individual was dependent on the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and it was dependent upon them being in balance or harmony. Throughout the Middle Ages and into the early modern period, medical science still subscribed to this theory. And as we all know today, it was pretty much useless. Patients who were treated according to the theory of the 4 humors recovered in spite of, not because of, the treatment of their physicians. While concilia had been a literary tradition before the arrival of the plague, between 1348 and 1350, there was a veritable flood of them being produced by medical professionals throughout the medieval world. What's interesting is that many of them take rather unusual forms. While most are formal, technical documents, some are written as letters to the leaders of a particular community. For example, 5 physicians in Strasbourg composed theirs as a collaborative effort, addressed it to the leaders of that town, and entitled their work, "The Treasure of Wisdom and Art." Some concilia were actually written in verse. As subsequent outbreaks of plague occurred, more and more of these were composed. Some scholars estimate that between 1348 and 1500, some 900 plague tracts were written. Along with the surge of popularity of plague tracts came an interest in the theme of the ars moriendi, or art of dying. I mentioned the long-form text of this theme in the last lecture, as it was a place where visual representations of plague and death and dying were often included in the form of woodcuts. The images in that text served a purpose for those who might be illiterate, or at least unable to read Latin, and those images helped in visual terms to convey what the words on the text were concerned with. The ars moriendi, as you may recall, first of all admonishes the reader to not be afraid of death, and then offers a checklist of the sorts of temptations that a person on the point of dying must beware of. Because when a person is on the point of death, that is when Satan is most likely to move in and try to claim the soul for himself. Those who are close to death should beware of pride, impatience, avarice, lack of faith, and perhaps most importantly, despair, which is really the one unforgivable sin. If you despair, then you have given up on the possibility that God might save you, and God, being all-powerful, can, of course, always intercede and claim your soul for himself. After this checklist, there comes some practical advice. The third section lays out 7 questions that one should ask a dying person in order to help them prepare themselves for the experience yet to come. The fourth is concerned with counseling people to try and imitate the example of Christ while still alive, while the fifth concerns the specifics of how to go about death and dying. Where should your family stand around your deathbed? What things should be said or not said? What kind of comforts should be offered or maybe withheld? The text wraps up with a final section detailing the prayers that should be said on the occasion of a person's death. While it's to be expected that many texts composed after 1348 would deal explicitly with illness, death, and dying, since half the population had died and an additional percentage had contracted plague but managed to survive, there were other, more literary works that dealt with the social repercussions in the aftermath of the Black Death. As we'll see in a later lecture on the socio-economic effects of plague, the Great Mortality had completely undone and discombobulated the long-standing social order of the 3 estates or 3 orders: those who fight, those who pray, and those who work. A rising merchant class that didn't quite fit had been coming into its own just before the plague struck. The arrival of the Black Death accentuated and enhanced the way in which this group challenged the rigidity of the 3 orders model, because suddenly there were boundless economic opportunities for those who survived. The peasants were able to become clergy, the merchants were gaining increased wealth and status, and the nobles, cash-strapped and short of laborers to work their lands, started to do what had been unimaginable just a few years before. They started marrying members of the merchant class. The merchants wanted titles, the nobles wanted money, and there you have it. The English writer William Langland explored the effect this had on society in his allegorical dream vision poem known as Piers Plowman. In this poem, a man named Will has the series of dreams that offer instruction and commentary on how to live properly. What's very interesting about this poem is that Will's dream vision guide is a figure known as Piers the Plowman. This choice is interesting because it's not a knight or bishop or other religious figure that guides Will on his quest, but a member of the lowest order of society. In the poem, Piers offers plenty of criticism of corrupt members of all classes. In particular, the church receives a large share of criticism, and in one famous scene, Piers takes a pardon that has been issued by the church and tears it in half in anger, an act that most have seen as a reaction against the buying and selling of forgiveness of sins by corrupt members of the clergy. But even as it critiques corruption on all levels of society, the poem also offers a very conservative view of how society should be ordered. In another famous moment, a group of people get together in order to help Piers with the plowing of a half-acre of land. A knight enthusiastically joins in, indicating that he is willing to labor too if Piers will just show him how to do it. As you may recall from our discussion of this moment in Lecture 1, Piers's response is to say, "No, this is wrong. Knights should not be plowing. Their job is to protect the rest of the society. I'll do it as long as you promise to protect me and the church." Or, in Middle English, "Ik shall swinka en sweta en soa for us botha, and labora for they wealthy lu livest, I'll be loif toim." in covenant that do keep a holy church and me selva for wasters and wicked men. This scene is most obviously a commentary on how the social order was coming apart and there was movement between states. Society would be best served, Langland is saying, if people stayed in their estate and worked to be the best knight or bishop or plowman they could be. Even though this seems to be Langland's intent, in a later lecture we'll see how the poem actually was used by the leaders of an uprising to promote their cause. Because a plowman was the hero, the leaders of the English uprising of 1381, also sometimes called the Peasants' Revolt, saw in the poem Piers Plowman a justification for the upward movement of the lower classes. Of all the literature inspired by the plague, however, the most important is without a doubt Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron. Boccaccio was born in the early 14th century in Florence, or just outside that great Italian city-state. He came from a well-to-do Florentine family. His father was a banker and wanted a young Giovanni to follow in his footsteps. Boccaccio preferred to study law, and his father consented to this. But after 6 years, Boccaccio found he really didn't like law. What he did like was studying and learning, particularly in the fields of science, medicine, and literature. He had as his mentor and tutor the great Francesco Petrarca, better known simply as Petrarch, about whom I did a whole lecture in my Great Minds of the Medieval World course. Petrarch was arguably the father of the Italian Renaissance, an accomplished writer who was the first poet laureate to be crowned since the days of the Roman Empire. And he was a traveler. You recall that he had traveled to Avignon, which is where he first laid eyes on his beloved Laura, who was married to another man. Upon her death, which may have been from plague, but also could have been due to another disease or postpartum complications, Petrarch wrote movingly of his grief. As Boccaccio's mentor, Petrarch translated Homer's Iliad and Odyssey from Greek into Latin at his pupil's request. Boccaccio traveled with his father to Naples when the latter became head of a bank there. In that city, Boccaccio composed some of the most important works in the Italian canon, including the Teseda and Il Filostrato, both of which would greatly influence Geoffrey Chaucer, the father of English poetry, as well as many other works. Boccaccio returned to Florence, and there he began to work on the Decameron. As you probably recall, the premise of the Decameron is that a group of noble youths have fled plague-ravaged Florence and headed to an estate in the country to wait until the Black Death has finished with the city. In order to pass the time, the young nobles take turns telling stories. There are 10 of them, 7 young women and 3 young men, and each must tell a story every night for 2 weeks, with 2 nights off each week for the completion of chores and other necessary activities. Thus, at the end of 10 nights of storytelling, the group will have heard 100 stories, hence the title Decameron, which comes from the Greek words for 10 and day. Each member of the group gets to act as king or queen for a day, meaning he or she gets to pick the general theme or instruct the others as to what the subject matter is for that day's round of storytelling. This frame story of the nobles telling tales to pass the time is an ingenious way of grouping together stories from a whole bunch of different genres into just one text, allowing Boccaccio to include stories that deal with holy saints, ribald and risque stories about adulterous husbands and wives, moral fables that impart a lesson, medieval romance stories about knights and chivalry, and pretty much everything in between. Boccaccio had completed the work by 1353, just as the first wave of the plague was dying down to smoldering embers in the medieval world. He chose to write the text not in Latin, as most scholars would have at the time, but in his native Florentine dialect of Italian, which made it accessible to a broader audience beyond just the clergy or the very well-educated. At the beginning and end of each day of storytelling, Boccaccio includes some additional framing details relating what activities the group had engaged in during the day, so we get a kind of slice of life of the 14th century Italian countryside. The stories themselves were borrowed from other sources. This was a standard practice for writers in the Middle Ages, but Boccaccio made them his own by recasting all the characters and events to reflect 14th century Italian culture, and here and there he even put real historical figures into the stories. He also took basic plot lines and deliberately complexified them, making them much more interesting and nuanced in the process. Now, included in this collection are several stories that have no known literary source, and many scholars think that these might have been traditional stories that were circulating orally at the time. Boccaccio was just the first to put them down in a manuscript. Inspiring Boccaccio to preserve these stories for posterity was yet another gift, we might say, that the plague gave to humanity, even as it was taking so much else away. But the part of the Decameron that gets the most attention is Boccaccio's introduction, in which he details the horrors that the Black Death had wrought on the city of Florence. I've already quoted various parts of this in many of our earlier lectures. Although he actually borrowed part of this intro from an earlier description of plague written by Paul the Deacon in the 8th century, Boccaccio includes enough details and specifics for us to know that, while some of the structure, and indeed some of the lines themselves, come from the earlier source, it's still a more or less accurate reflection of what happened in Florence during the Black Death. Boccaccio describes accurately the buboes that appeared on those afflicted with plague, the desertion of people by their family members once it became clear that they were infected, the mass burials that took place at the height of the epidemic, and the terrifying rapidity with which the disease could spread from one person to another. He tells his reader that, quote, "What with the lack of appropriate means for tending the sick and the virulence of the plague, the number of deaths reported in the city, whether by day or night, was so enormous that it astonished all who heard tell of it, to say nothing of the people who actually witnessed the carnage," end quote. He concludes his preface by noting that, quote, "It is reliably thought that over 100,000 human lives were extinguished within the walls of the city of Florence. Yet before this lethal catastrophe fell upon the city, it is doubtful whether anyone would have guessed it contained so many inhabitants," end quote. Geoffrey Chaucer, the father of English poetry, was deeply influenced by Boccaccio. Indeed, his Knight's Tale is a version of Boccaccio's Tisada. The Reeve's Tale is based on one of the stories told in the Decameron, and his masterpiece, Troilus and Cressade, was based on Boccaccio's Il Filostrato. Chaucer's unfinished masterpiece, The Canterbury Tales, took the Decameron as its source for the idea of structuring a collection of tales. And just as Boccaccio was an innovator and reviser of existing narratives, so too did Chaucer rework the material and themes he found in Boccaccio to put his own definitive stamp on the texts he composed. For example, whereas Boccaccio's Decameron consists of tales told by a group of nobles, all of whom seem rather flat in terms of characterization and almost interchangeable, Chaucer's storytellers are representatives drawn from the three orders of society, and they are all skillfully and cleverly individualized. The use of representative stock characters from the three orders had long been popular in literature, and indeed, this genre had its own name, estates satire. What Chaucer did that was so revolutionary was to take the conventions of estate satire, combine it with the tale-telling game of Boccaccio, and then tweak both of these, to make a text that was utterly original in many ways. He contrives a means to get members of all the orders of society together by coming up with the idea of a large group of people traveling from London to Canterbury on a pilgrimage to the shrine of Thomas Becket. Or, in the words of Chaucer's prologue, "The holy blissful martyr forta seca, that hem hath hope and one that they were seca." In English, that's to seek the holy blissful martyr that had helped them when they were sick. The illness mentioned here that many pilgrims prayed to St. Thomas for deliverance from may very well be plague. Along the way, these pilgrims partake in a storytelling contest to pass the time. While Chaucer's pilgrim group contains stock characters, a valiant knight, a noble squire who's mostly interested in singing, dancing, and women, a corrupt friar, a dishonest miller, and more, he also includes several characters that don't quite fit into the three estates. The wife of Bath, who is 5 times married and a member of the merchant class engaged in the cloth trade, a shipman, a doctor, a man of law, and several others. This is a text that could not have been written before the plague. Chaucer began work on it in the late 1380s after several outbreaks of plague had discombobulated the social order. In 1340, it might have seemed downright revolutionary to compose such a text. By 1380, though, with the Three Estates model broken down and society remaking itself in a new image, the Canterbury Tales seemed a timely commentary on the current state of the world. Given how much plague Chaucer had seen in his lifetime, he was born around 1340 and so was about 7 or 8 when the first and deadliest outbreak of the Great Pestilence made its way through the medieval world. It's surprising there isn't more mention of the plague in the Canterbury Tales. Apart from the reference to the intercession of Thomas Becket, and it's not even clear that he's interceding only in instances of plague, he may be helping people with any kind of illness. There are 2 more clear references to plague in Chaucer's text. A character in the Knight's Tale dies of plague at the end, and the Pardoner's Tale is set in a world where people are being struck down left and right by the Black Death. In that tale, 3 companions, upset about how many people death has carried off, decide to go out and find death and kill him. They ask an old man if he can show them where death is, and he obliges. When the companions arrive at the spot, however, they find not death, but a pile of gold. Each of them tries to contrive a way to keep the gold for himself. When one of them goes to town to fetch food and drink so that they can feed themselves while they watch over the gold that night, the 2 who remain behind plot to kill him. Meanwhile, the 3rd man poisons the wine he brings back with him. Upon his return, the 2 waiting with the gold kill him. After he's dead, they sit down and have a drink, and then die agonizing deaths. So the 3 men, indeed, find death. But it's not only the case that Chaucer wouldn't and couldn't have written the Canterbury Tales had it not been for the Black Death. The most important point to understand here is that without the Black Death, Geoffrey Chaucer could not have become Chaucer. As I said, he was born around 1340 into a pretty well-to-do family. They were part of the newly rising merchant class, and they worked in the wine trade. A good part of their business concerned the import of wine from the continent. With the arrival of the Black Death in England in 1348, and the fact that young Geoffrey Chaucer survived it, his fortunes began to look even more promising. In 1361, Chaucer was studying law at the Inns of Chancery, but a new outbreak of plague shut down the school. He then turned his hand to poetry and a translation of the French Romance of the Rose, while still working in the wine business and also serving as a page or servant in some noble households. He's first mentioned in court records in 1357, when he was serving as a page in the household of Elizabeth the Berg, Countess of Ulster. What's important to recognize here is that Chaucer's father's bourgeois merchant connections probably helped get Geoffrey a position in the household. The other thing that's important to recognize is how significant it was that he was in this household. Elizabeth the Berg was the wife of Lionel, Duke of Clarence, who was one of the sons of King Edward III. Thus, due to his presence in this household, Chaucer was very close to the inner circle of the royal family. Young Chaucer seems to have acquitted himself well and soon rose up the ranks as a civil servant. He even traveled to the continent when his master's household, when Edward III invaded France. He was tasked more and more with diplomatic missions overseas, and he did some extensive traveling in France, Spain, Flanders, and Italy, which is where he became acquainted with the work of Boccaccio. And then, in 1369, something both horrible and wonderful happened. Blanche of Lancaster, wife of John of Gaunt, who was the son of Edward III and the richest man in England, died of plague. I say horrible because, well, she died of plague, by all accounts leaving John of Gaunt bereft. But I say wonderful because here is where Chaucer became Geoffrey Chaucer, father of English poetry. In response to Blanche's death, he composed the dream vision poem known as the Book of the Duchess. In this poem, Chaucer shows off his skill and his learning. The text is full of classical references, allusions to other important texts like the Romance of the Rose, and references to noble pastimes like hunting. At the center of the poem, however, the dreamer encounters a noble knight who is lamenting the loss of his lady. When pressed, the knight tells the dreamer that he was playing a game of chess with Fortune, and Fortune beat him and took his queen. Now clearly, this is an allegorical chess game, but the dreamer takes the knight's story literally, telling him not to be so sad over losing a game. The knight then proceeds to tell the story of his sorrows, how he first fell in love with his lady, whom he calls White, a play on the Duchess of Lancaster's name Blanche, how it took a long time for White to reciprocate his love, but how once she did, their life together was perfect. And then finally, he reveals that White is dead. With this last piece of information, the dreamer suddenly understands that this is not a chess game at all. The poem ends with the dreamer waking in his chamber, remembering his dream, and deciding that it should be set into verse. And so, Chaucer wrote it down. Some scholars think the poem was composed at Gaunt's request. Others think Chaucer undertook the project on his own and presented it to the Duke of Lancaster as a commemoration of his wife. Whichever version is correct, the writing of this poem is what set Chaucer on a path that led away from civil service and diplomacy and toward literary immortality. There may not be many silver linings to be found in the dark cloud of the Black Death, but the creation of enduring works of art by people like Boccaccio, Langland, and Chaucer is certainly one of them. Many texts were composed in response to the plague. Medical treatises, chronicles, letters of warning, sermons, masses, poetry, and more. It is an astonishing body of literature that emerged from the plague years, and together, these texts make up a literary memento mori, a reminder that, eventually, we're all going to die, and these texts incorporate every order of society. It was a lesson that medieval people, especially those still alive in 1353, knew all too well. It is safe to say, I think, that the epidemic that swept through the medieval world between 1347 and 1353 dramatically affected every aspect of life for every person who lived through the Great Mortality. Whether it was hit directly or not, every town, village, city, and nation changed in response to the plague. For even those few places that, by some measure of luck, managed to escape the worst of the epidemic were still transformed by the fact that the communities around them, the ones they traded with, did business with, or had other relationships with, were affected, and thus the relationships between these communities changed abruptly in one way or another. In this lecture, we're going to explore the economic impact of the Black Death on the medieval world. We could do several lectures on this topic, particularly if we were to focus on specific nations and communities. So in the interest of time, we'll stick to the broad economic trends that the Black Death both undermined and created. Several scholars have argued that the Black Death was the most important turning point in the history of the Middle Ages, and that without it, Europe might not have entered the early modern period when it did, sometime in the 16th century. Scholars like the late, great David Herlihy have suggested that without the social upheaval of the plague, the medieval world might have kept on chugging along for an extra century or so, before the ideas and social trends that we think of as key to the Renaissance came into existence. Now, when we talk about the economic and political impact of the plague, we have to be conscious that we're going to need to examine the question from 2 points of view. The first is the most immediate. What happened during and right after the outbreak of the Black Death? That impact was dramatic and far-reaching, and it shook medieval society to its core. But long-term, what we see is a gradual adaptation and accommodation with the realities of plague. This had to happen because after the first outbreak in the mid-14th century, plague tended to return around once a decade or so over the course of the next 200+ years. What this meant in demographic terms is that the population was not able to start recovering until around the year 1500, because every time medieval society would start to get back on its feet, there would be another outbreak, and quite often it would carry off the young children of the people who had survived the last epidemic. These children were supposed to contribute to the population replacement, but since a big chunk of them got taken out of the picture every decade or so, the population losses of the first wave of plague remained persistent. However, because these later recurrences were nowhere near as virulent as the first outbreak in the 14th century, the population was able to make a modest recovery. The going was slow. The most obvious and immediate effect of the first wave of the Black Death was the loss of laborers, both skilled and unskilled. We've already seen how the expansion of the Cathedral of Siena was abandoned in the aftermath of the first wave, and how, in the realm of the arts, generally speaking, output diminished, stylistic traditions got simplified, and much more attention was paid to trends like the danse macabre and the memento mori tradition. This is quite simply because many of the master craftsmen, those who would be responsible for training apprentices, had died, and when they died, they took their knowledge and their skill with them. Much in the way of technique and trade secrets was lost in the aftermath of the first pandemic. This meant that people suddenly had to forge new economic and trade relationships almost overnight. If there are no blacksmiths in your town because all of them died, that doesn't change the fact that you still need to have your horse shod. Now, you might have to go to the next town over and use the services of that blacksmith if he'd survived. Even as most towns were struggling with the fact that the working population that had been the backbone of their economic infrastructure was radically diminished, they also had to confront an additional problem. The coffers of most civic institutions were being drained by necessary expenditures, just as the tax base was shrinking. We've seen, for example, how in places like Florence and Avignon, the ruling factions attempted to take action against the plague by doing things like setting up a board of health or establishing quarantine rules that needed to be enforced by officials appointed and paid for by the city. In Florence, people coming from Pisa were forbidden from entering the city, but enforcing this rule required a heavily manned cordon at the various entrances to Florentine territory, and those people manning the cordon needed to be paid. Other necessary expenditures included buying up tracts of land and designating them as cemeteries in order to accommodate the huge number of burials that suddenly needed to take place. There were also huge numbers of widows and orphans who needed charitable assistance. While most cities did engage in such charitable acts and had for some time as a matter of course, no one was prepared for the staggering number of such people who suddenly required assistance all at once. The economic strain on civic entities wouldn't have been so bad, except for the fact that the tax base the cities and nations depended on for monies to be spent in these areas was suddenly cut in half, and sometimes the losses to the tax base were even greater. Numerous heads of households were suddenly gone, either as victims of the plague or because they had fled the city and headed to the countryside to wait out the worst of the epidemic. This created an additional problem. All these houses were sitting vacant in the cities. In some instances, like in London, we see the well-to-do fleeing and leaving behind their servants to watch over their property. This practice became so widespread that one contemporary commented that the great houses in London in 1349 were almost wholly populated by servants, and they were hard-pressed to maintain the day-to-day running of a household because goods and services have become so scarce. In the countryside, there was the opposite problem. So many had died that livestock and farmland went untended. Cows, pigs, horses, goats. They reportedly roamed freely with no one to feed or milk them. In fact, there was such a surplus of livestock that we even have evidence of several lords of various manor estates in England turning down the payment of a horse or a cow that should have been part of a tax arrangement known as the Harriet, or death tax. You remember that when the head of a peasant household died, his family was supposed to pay a tax of their best beast to the lord on whose manor they lived and worked. Since the strongest, most able-bodied member of the family was now gone, the best beast was a payment made to cover the decline in labor and production. As you can imagine, in 1349, the particular peasant family in this situation had any number of beasts to choose from their own herd, from those of their relatives who had passed away and willed them to them, and from those that belonged to their neighbors who had died without heirs and that were simply free for the taking. Now the Lord usually had no need for yet another animal to take care of, and so decided rather graciously to forego the Harriet. The thing is, the animal would also be a problem for the family, as they probably had their hands full as well. And because the livestock market was suddenly flooded with available animals, the prices of these animals plummeted almost overnight. It was definitely a buyer's market that nobody really wanted or needed to buy. And it wasn't just the mortality caused by the plague that led to untended fields and roaming livestock. Peasants who had once resigned themselves to a lifetime of scratching out a subsistence living, working their own fields and those of their lord, suddenly saw an opportunity for a better life. Perhaps in the cities, which, as I noted before, were in many cases almost empty. You might think that this would mean these new arrivals from the countryside would be welcome, But while that's partially true, in many instances, newcomers placed yet an additional strain on the civic coffers. They couldn't just move into the empty houses. In a society that was structured hierarchically in terms of relationships of service, dependence, loyalty, and protection, new strategies needed to be developed to cope with the sudden appearance of groups of people who could and did move throughout the countryside wherever they liked. Such groups were in need of some sort of regulation. Again, this is a task that would require more civic officials to figure out and then execute. So there's more tax money gone again. But laborers in the countryside didn't only head to the cities. In many instances, they headed just down the road to the next manor or landholder's property that needed working. And because the fields were in danger of not being plowed or sown or harvested, which could have meant starvation for a large portion of the population that had survived, many landowners found themselves willing or needing to pay cash wages for able bodies who were willing to work. Prior to this, especially in England, a serf was tied to his lord's land and received protection and a portion of the harvest in return for his labor. Now, he could go down the road to the next farm and demand cash wages, and high ones too, from the lord who was desperate for someone to sow his crops and harvest them. This was still not enough, though, to prevent the prices of grain and produce from increasing sharply in the two decades after the first outbreak of the Black Death, even as the prices of livestock plummeted. Even though there was more than enough to go around, some people still suffered some serious privation in the immediate aftermath of the Great Mortality's arrival. In some places where the plague hit especially hard, the citizens of a town that had been reduced to less than half its size and population might decide, there's no point in staying put. Rather, it would be better to pull up stakes and move to another community, one that had space because so many of its citizens had passed away. Thus, many smaller towns and cities were abandoned altogether, and the population begins to concentrate in clusters. This hadn't been possible in the early 1340s because the population of Europe had gotten so large, doubling from 75 million in the year 1000 to about 150 million in 1300. There had been a serious land crunch once that population increase was fully in place. But now, after the Black Death, there was plenty of land to be had by those who wanted it, and more land was opening up. Throughout the medieval world, but particularly in the Tuscan countryside, this trend was advanced by the practice of many urban merchants who saw a chance to become landowners. They bought up large parcels of land, joining together this piece and that piece for low prices. They then actively sought out laborers to work the land, establishing mezzadria, or formal sharecropping practices, that were quite favorable to the laborers, many of whom had been barely eking out a subsistence living until this time. A few urban merchants became importers of grain from the countryside, in addition to whatever their primary trade had been, and the farmers essentially became exporters of grain, which meant that they were also making money in trade. So, in terms of farms, cities, and trade centers, we have a double shift, what we might call concentration and specialization. Now, I'm generalizing quite a bit here, but before the plague, each medieval community, even the smallest, was usually diverse enough to meet all its inhabitants' needs. Agriculture was the main profession of everyone, yes, but most communities had a blacksmith for metalwork, a butcher to get livestock ready for the table, a brewer to make ale, since water was generally not safe to drink, a miller who would grind your grain so that you could then turn it into dough, and then you would take it to a baker's, who would have ovens where you could turn that dough into bread. You get the picture. As I've said before, a lot of people, when they first imagine what medieval people were like, tend to think that they must have been something like early American pioneers who did almost everything themselves. But that's really not the case. So, in the aftermath of the Black Death, with half the population gone, people tended to concentrate in cities, and smaller communities joined forces, so to speak. Another place we see this concentration and specialization is in the makeup of market towns. Throughout most of the medieval world, markets, sometimes called fairs when they were quite large, occurred on a regular basis. This is where people would gather to buy and sell goods. Those who lived out in the countryside would make regular trips into towns to trade their own produce or goods and purchase things that they needed and couldn't get in their own village. Because markets were lucrative for the towns in which they were held, in countries like England, your town actually had to be licensed to hold one. Any old town couldn't declare that they were holding a market just because they felt like it. We know that in England in 1340, just before the arrival of the Black Death, there was somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,500 licensed market towns. That number shrank pretty dramatically within a couple of years, and then it kept shrinking throughout the next 200 years as plague kept reappearing and keeping population numbers low. So by 1550, the number of licensed market towns was down to 600. At the same time that numerous communities sort of joined forces and combined their markets or fairs to be more effective, they also moved away from the model in which a fair would have numerous buying options for the tastes, interests, and needs of a large and varied population. Now, markets tended to be more thematically organized. Over here in this village was the market for cloth and leather goods. This market over there in this other town was generally concerned with produce. Yet another market focused on the needs of metal workers and woodworkers and their output, etc., etc. One consequence of the disappearance of a large portion of the productive workforce was that people who had not typically been members of that workforce now joined it. And I'm speaking specifically here of women. While women had always been contributors to the medieval economy in a limited capacity, many of them now stepped up and became full-fledged members of various occupations and trades. If your husband had been, for example, an apothecary, then as his wife, you'd probably assisted with making up the mixtures that were your stock in trade. If he died of the plague, then you most likely would just step up and take over so that you could keep feeding your family. This pattern played out in lots of professions and trades, and the incorporation of more women into a workforce that was desperately in need of more laborers had another side effect. Women did not have as many children as they had in the past. In part, this was because they were often working jobs they wouldn't have previously. And with the increase of disposable income and a more upscale, comfortable lifestyle, many women also seem to have opted not to have children, so that they could enjoy the benefits and enhanced quality of life brought on by this unexpected wealth, and to keep from having to spend this money on some extra offspring. This in turn kept birth rates so low that the demographic rebound was not happening as quickly as people might have hoped. And with there being another plague outbreak every decade or so for the next 200 years, this meant that the population would take centuries to recover. So generally speaking, a whole lot of wealth started to get concentrated with just a few people. If you were lucky enough to survive the first wave, you were probably the inheritor of all kinds of money and property from your various relatives who had passed away. As we've seen in previous lectures, those who recognized what was happening took steps to draw up their wills in record numbers, and in those wills, many people left significant goods and monies to the church, either as an act of thanks or piety, or perhaps in the hope that this good deed might speed their way into heaven. So the church became increasingly wealthy, as did many other individuals who suddenly had large amounts of disposable income. This changed life dramatically for almost everyone, and it tended to change it for the better. Serfs were able to become tenant farmers or even enter professions that had previously been closed to them, like the order of the clergy, something that would have been absolutely unheard of in 1340. Because the clergy had lost numbers at the same rate as the rest of society, they were in desperate need to fill their ranks, so they were willing to accept people whom they never would have accepted before. Usually, members of the clergy came from the highest order of the three estates, those who fight, the nobles. By the 14th century, most families throughout the medieval world were practicing primogeniture. They had figured out that if you divide property and wealth equally among heirs, you quickly dilute the inheritance, and within a couple of generations, what once might have been a large estate that produced an income that could support a whole family with plenty left over had instead become a small plot of land next to a bunch of other small plots of land from which your descendants could barely scratch out a subsistence living. So fairly early on, the system of primogeniture came into common use, whereby the eldest son inherited pretty much everything. Second sons and daughters had to marry well or else join a religious order, and even doing that usually cost a substantial amount of money, a gift that the family made to the monastery or convent when they accepted the child into its ranks. But in the aftermath of the plague, the ranks of the clergy opened their doors to people farther down the social order, a fact that dramatically changed the nature and character of the medieval church. The church could do this in part because it was now less dependent upon the donations or dowries that such admittance usually brought with it, because the church itself became a concentrated site of wealth in the face of so many deaths and bequests. It wasn't only the church that found itself with so much surplus wealth. Plenty of individuals who had been living modest lives found themselves, all of a sudden, large landholders or possessors of other valuable property. With this excess wealth, they can do things like send their children to excellent schools to be educated. This is probably the case with Geoffrey Chaucer's family. The Chaucers were already rather well-to-do members of the growing merchant class and had long been involved in the wine trade. In the wake of the plague, those who had survived in almost any profession found themselves with sudden access to shipping routes and buyers and sellers that had been hard to come by before. Just by the sheer luck of surviving, if you were a vintner or a cloth merchant, you might find yourself with a virtual monopoly in a particular market or community or trade network. So economically speaking, part of what the plague did was speed the rise of the already up-and-coming merchant class. To be sure, this group was already somewhat complicating the ideal of the three estates model before the Black Death came on the scene. The orders of nobles, clergy, and everyone else had remained entrenched quite easily when the medieval world was a primarily agrarian society. But by the 14th century, with trade networks and a cash economy coming into its own, the merchants were only rather tentatively able to be contained within that everyone else category of the three estates. With the arrival of the plague, they suddenly had more money than they knew what to do with. It's a fascinating contradiction. On the one hand, the deaths of so many laborers, artisans, and other people who performed key functions in medieval society meant that suddenly things that had been easy, like getting a loaf of bread baked or sending your cow for slaughter or getting new horseshoes for your horse. Those things were much more difficult. But on the other hand, the fact that now there was all this disposable income available, especially to people who had been on the upwardly mobile trajectory before the plague, meant that there was an increase in demand for luxury goods. You might not be able to get your grain ground close to home, but you could purchase silk and furs and spices and other luxuries that came from the distant East. Indeed, many scholars contend that the Black Death was one of the factors that broadened the worldview of medieval people and connected the medieval world more firmly to Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa. To be sure, it was along already established trade routes from the East that the plague had made its way into the medieval world, and in the immediate post-epidemic period, the people of the medieval world themselves were not doing too much long-distance voyaging in the interests of trade. But at the same time, if books and jewels and metalwork and other items from exotic locations started to show up in the markets in port cities, those who were newly flush with cash were eager to buy these things. And here again, we come up against the fact that the ideal society, made up of 3 estates, was simply not going to last as a model of social organization for much longer. Pretty soon, many merchants had acquired wealth on par with the nobles, who had lost substantial holdings and income because of the lack of laborers to work their land. Or at least, there were laborers who were willing to work, but they were going to do it in exchange for simply a promise of protection and low wages. They could and did demand higher wages, and in many cases left the land on which they and their families had lived for years in search of better pay and opportunities for advancement elsewhere. Desperate to maintain their status and distinction from the rest of medieval society, many nobles got behind the passage of sumptuary laws, which restricted the kinds of clothes that could be worn by people of particular ranks. For example, in many places, certain kinds of fur or silk trim were by law not permitted for members below the ranks of the nobility. In some cases, the richness of the clothing you wore was directly tied to how much income you made per year. For example, the wife of a merchant making 20 pounds a year could wear a more elaborate headdress made with greater amounts of linen than could the wife of a merchant whose income was 15 pounds, according to the sumptuary laws. In the end, the social ideal of the 3 estates was undone by a phenomenon that could not have been imagined 50 years earlier. Cash-strapped nobles, desperate for income with which to pay for the laborers they needed to keep their estates running, started to marry members of the merchant class who were themselves suddenly wealthy but also deeply desirous of climbing up the social ladder. A title was what well-to-do merchant families wanted more than anything. This narrative played out in Geoffrey Chaucer's own family. His granddaughter, Alice, became the Duchess of Suffolk. Not bad for a girl descended from a winemaker and a civil servant who had made a name for himself writing poetry. So after the plague, everyone who survived was pretty much better off than they had been before, with one exception. As you may have gathered, the nobles found their lives transformed just like everyone else, and not necessarily in a good way. It's a fact of human society that people tend to try to hold on to privilege and status once they have it. The nobles felt threatened by the socio-economic shifts taking place and sought to do whatever they could to maintain the status quo. Sumptuary laws are just one example of that. In order to effect laws that would maintain their power and position, the nobility needed to enter the realm of the political, which is where many of these concerns and the shape of the new society that arose from the ashes of the Black Death would be determined. We'll turn our attention to the political world and how it responded to the onslaught of the plague. We discuss the economic ramifications of the Black Death. While the medieval world was initially dealt a stunning blow with the loss of craftsmen, artisans, tradespeople, and laborers of every type, by the 1370s, the economic situation had somewhat stabilized. Livestock prices came up from their record low when the market was flooded with animals whose owners had passed away. Grain prices came down from their record high when there was a shortage of laborers to plant crops and bring in the harvest. And for the majority of the individual inhabitants of the medieval world, if you had managed to survive the plague, you were better off after than you had been before. At the same time, however, those at the upper levels of society suddenly found themselves under economic pressure as they needed to pay higher wages to laborers who would work their land. Similarly, civic and political bodies were affected negatively in terms of economics, as much of their tax base had died, and there were suddenly thousands of widows and orphans who needed charity in order to survive. Regulating and enforcing new legislation that came into being in the post-plague world also strained the resources of these larger civic and political entities. As you might imagine, when something like this happens, it's not just social and economic changes that occur. Those two elements are really inextricable from the political sphere. In this lecture, we're going to look at how the political scene in several places throughout the medieval world was dramatically changed as both individuals and collective organizations responded to the chaos that the Black Death had unleashed on the medieval world. We'll see that, in many instances, governments tried to maintain the status quo in a world that was nothing like the one out of which earlier social and political ideals, like the Three Estates model, had arisen. In the aftermath of the Great Pestilence, the world changed for the better for most people, and, not surprisingly, when governments tried to force the genie of opportunity and social mobility back in the bottle, it did not go. What's really interesting about how the political world changed as a result of the Black Death is that we have what I like to think of as three very distinct stages: the short term, the long term, and the extended term. Again, I'm generalizing here, as each community's response was going to be somewhat different, but broadly speaking, we see this pattern more or less across the entire medieval world. Now, in the short term, everything pretty much went to hell, and law and order and so many of the hallmarks of civilization fell by the wayside. In the long term, however, most political and governing bodies proved to be resilient and bounced back from the trauma of the plague pretty quickly. As historian Christopher Dyer puts it, quote, "The main impression is of a civilized and organized society doing its best to make decent arrangements in desperately difficult circumstances." End quote. So while in some places, like Pistoia, Italy, the governing council didn't even bother to meet during the height of the epidemic, once that had passed, people tried to get back to business pretty quickly. So that's the long-term political result, what seems at first to be a negligible change. But if we consider the extended term, we find that the world was utterly changed by the plague, and while the long-standing governing structures were able to remain in place, they had to adapt to a new world in which the lower classes had more social and economic power and status than they ever had before, and thus they had more of a say in how they were affected and governed by the powers that be. This shift was particularly noticeable in England, as we'll see in a few minutes. But first, let's talk some more about the short term. As you might guess, and as I've already said, in the short term, everything went to hell, and it was some sort of semi-post-apocalyptic Walking Dead scenario in most places in the medieval world. To put it bluntly, most of the people who were supposed to run stuff were dead or had fled, and in the vacuum of order that created, everyone else pretty much ran wild. For example, in Barcelona, civic duties were overseen by a body known as the Conseil de Cent, or Council of 100, and they, in turn, oversaw a number of city officials who served as councillors and reported to that body. In 1348, 4/5 of the city councillors died from the plague. 4/5. That number is way above the 50% average death toll that we see elsewhere. The Council of 100 should have stepped up to appoint new councillors and enact new legislation to cope with the tragedy, except almost all of them had died as well. Moreover, the city's ruler, Père the Ceremonious, aka Peter, and this is a guy who has many different Roman numerals after his name, Peter V, Peter II, depending on which territory we're discussing. He was King of Aragon, King of Sardinia and Corsica, King of Valencia, and Count of Barcelona. In any event, Pere, or Peter, lost his wife to the epidemic, and while plague may have helped him hold on to Barcelona for a while, because it struck his territories of Valencia and Aragon first, and undermined rebel activity there, which allowed him to regain power he'd been on the verge of losing. Well, since plague was an equal opportunity killer, the end result was that he had much less administrative control than he'd had pre-plague, because most of his administrators had died. Similar scenarios were playing out throughout the medieval world. Orvieto, Italy, was overseen by a council of 7, 6 of whom died in the first wave of plague. They also had a council of 12, but every single one of them succumbed to the plague. The city of London was overseen by a group of 24 aldermen, but 8 of them died in the first outbreak of plague. This was a much better result than what we saw throughout the rest of the medieval world. Only 1/3 mortality for this governing body. Once the first wave had passed, they were able to function with a fair degree of authority. But this was the exception, and we don't know as many details about London as we would like, since the Great Fire of 1666 destroyed a lot in the way of evidence of civic governance and activity. We've already seen how Florence's city councillors were diminished in number due to both the high mortality rate and the fact that those who could were fleeing the city for the countryside, where they planned to ride out the worst of the plague. Those who stayed in the city and remained alive managed to pass a law that would fine city officials for running away and neglecting their duties. But this was difficult to enforce because who was there to do so? Scholar Joseph Byrne describes the situation best, I think. He says, quote, "In the absence of effective government, offices went unfilled, taxes uncollected, records unkept, personnel unhired, salaries unpaid, criminals unpunished, wills unproved, and key decisions unmade. Without notaries and last wills, orphans were often left without their inheritances, or had them plundered by false friends, unscrupulous and parasitic adult kin or family friends. In the wake of the plague, both guild and municipal councils often had to lower qualifications, such as age and experience, to fill positions and replenish guild rolls." End quote. Now, once the first big wave of the epidemic had passed, normalcy was restored in most places. But while the governing structures, like councils and guilds, were back in place, the composition of those bodies looked very different because of the impact. Let's take a look at a couple of examples from Italy and England that show how this happened. We briefly discussed the Ciompi revolt in our case study of Florence, but I think it's worth revisiting because it's such an excellent example of political change wrought by the plague. Now, as you remember, Florence was especially hard hit by plague in 1348, and then again in 1363 and 1370. While some semblance of civic order was maintained, taxes and fines had to be levied against those who fled the city and shirked their duties. One of Florence's most important exports was wool, and the production of this product was a multi-step process that involved both skilled and unskilled workers, some of whom were represented by the powerful guild association, and some of whom did not have a voice in city government. Once the first wave of plague had passed, Florence was desperate to bring in revenue by increasing its production of wool and bringing that back to pre-plague levels. In order to do this, it needed more laborers, and it found them out in the countryside, in the contado. The city began a process of recruitment to bring these fresh bodies in and supply the labor that was needed to get the wool production back up to full speed. But even though these laborers were much sought after, they were allowed no voice in city government and no representation. This was no problem in the pre-plague world. In 1346, the medieval world was experiencing a population crunch, which meant that people were grateful for any sort of work and stable income that they could find. But in the post-plague world, when laborers were suddenly in demand, this group thought that maybe they should be treated a little better. So these laborers, who were mostly immigrants to the city, were able to make a decent living economically, and soon rose in terms of power and status. They came to be called the gente nuova, or new people, and even though they acquired some measure of wealth, they were not able to manage any sort of presence in local government, because that was a position reserved for those of aristocratic status. But as I said before, after the short-term horrors of the plague, the long-term response was to try and get things back to normal, back to the way they were before. And that's exactly what the Florentine government tried to do. So long-term, and by long-term I mean about 3 decades or so after the initial outbreak of the Black Death, a return to a pre-plague state of things was attempted. But it was an artificial construct in this new world, and it just couldn't function. The gente nuova were welcomed in that they provided much-needed labor and a tax base, but they became increasingly discontent as they were taxed heavily to pay for much-needed civic necessities, yet themselves had no say in the government that was levying these taxes. The gente nuova found a common cause with another disgruntled faction of the citizenry, the arti minori. The arti minori, or minor guilds, were those guilds that were considered second tier in the political system of Florence. They had long had a contentious relationship with the arti maggiori. The arti maggiori consisted of 7 powerful major guilds, and they were a major force in Florentine government, with some city officials being selected directly from their ranks. So there were tensions everywhere, within the oligarchy that was meant to govern Florence, between the arti maggiori and the arti minori, between the oligarchy and the gente nuova, and between the guilds and the ruling classes, and a group known as the popolo minuto, literally the little people. In the ranks of the little people were all kinds of artisans whose work was essential to the cloth trade, but they did not have guild representation. Now, in some cases, these groups overlapped. Some gente nuova were also popolo minuto, and some were members of the arti minori. And then there was also a middle tier of guilds, the arti medie, whose interests could and did sometimes align with the arti maggiori and sometimes with the arti minori. To put it simply, it's kind of a political and economic mess, And on top of all this, those in power tried to reimpose a pre-plague governance system on those who were living and working in Florence without really trying to adapt at all to this new reality. If you remember our case study of Florence, you know where this is going. In 1378, what has come to be called the Ciompi Revolt began. Ciompi is the word that designated the wool carders of Florence, but many other groups were involved in their revolt. Now, when this whole thing began in June of 1378, there was nothing violent or really revolt-like about it. It started with the Ciompi demanding better representation among the civic officials of Florence. The ruling oligarchy responded in a way that might have worked in a pre-plague world. They made it harder to get into a guild, and they quadrupled the fee that people were required to pay for membership. In other words, instead of becoming more representative in response to these demands, they became more elitist. As a result, some limited violence broke out in late June, with members of the Ciompi and their affiliates attacking some government buildings and letting prisoners out of jail. In reaction to this, the ruling body of Florence, the Signoria, agreed to talks with the Ciompi and said they would listen to their demands. What became clear almost immediately was that the government had no intention of really listening to or agreeing to any of the Ciompi's demands. They were stalling, hoping that eventually the agitators would get bored or lose interest and find something else to do. They adopted some vague half measures, hoping this would be enough to appease the lower classes. But they were so wrong. All it did was make the rebels even angrier. Many historians agree that if the Signoria had sincerely given just a little in the way of status and power to the lower classes, the whole Ciompi rebellion might have been avoided. On July 21st, 1378, a full-blown rebellion broke out. Thousands of Ciompi and their associates forcibly ousted the members of the Signoria and placed one of their own in the position of gonfaloniere of justice. They took the official executioner and hanged him by his feet in the Palazzo Vecchio. They demanded that the Signoria create 3 new official guilds and also decree that members of these guilds would hold public office. What they wanted, essentially, was representation for those in the arti minori and for the guildless popolo minuto to be given a guild with a voice in civic affairs. As far as revolts go, this seems to a modern person to be a rather reasonable series of requests. For example, they didn't want to overturn the guild system completely. They just wanted it to be more representative. For 3 years, the government of the city-state of Florence was run by members of the Ciompi Guild. But soon, factionalism arose among members of the Ciompi for a series of reasons that's really too complex for us to discuss at any great length here. And in August 1378, fighting broke out among the Ciompi and other guild factions, and the civic leaders were replaced in one of the bloodiest days in Florence's history. But they were replaced by other members of the lower classes, and the city would continue to be ruled by them until 1382, when members of the aristocracy were able to rally together and oust the Ciompi and their allies from positions of civic leadership. Once the aristocratic patriciate was back in power, they sought both to shore up their position while also going ahead and enacting some of the reforms the Ciompi had wanted, in particular, a change in the tax system. In the extended term, Florence tried to return to what it had been like before the plague, but there was a new awareness of the power of the lower classes and a greater concern with protecting the interests of the elite noble families. While the basic structures in place in the political infrastructure of Florence were essentially the same as what we see pre-plague, the composition, interests, and powers of those bodies were altered greatly by the effects of the plague. Let's look at another example from the other side of the medieval world that shows this similar pattern of short-term, long-term, and extended-term effects. I'm talking about England. Now, almost immediately after the Black Death had swept through the country, serfs who had been tied to manorial lands started pulling up stakes and looking for estates whose lords were willing to pay more for their labor. Many left agriculture altogether and headed into the cities in search of opportunities among the tradesmen and merchants there. In 1351, King Edward III and Parliament passed the Statute of Laborers. What this law decreed is that all wages should be frozen at pre-plague levels, and it stipulated that there will be no more roaming around the countryside in search of the best deal for one's labor. People were supposed to stay on the manor or estate to which they belonged, unless they had the permission of the Lord to travel to some other place, and in that case, they had better be wearing a badge or livery of their Lord to indicate that they were about official business. Guess how this went over? Not well. We know this not so much from any primary documents from the laborers themselves. Remember, 90% of the population was illiterate at this time, but rather we know this because of the ongoing passage of laws meant to keep laborers and the lower classes in general in their place. In 1361, laws were passed affirming the Statute of Laborers and adding penalties for violating it that included imprisonment and even branding. This came about in part because the justices of the peace, who were supposed to enforce the statute, usually only enforced it in one direction. While theoretically they were supposed to make sure both that laborer stayed in place and that lords did not offer higher wages than those which were allowed, in practice, justices only punished members of the lower classes who broke the statute. Nobles who attempted to illegally outbid other nobles in order to secure workers generally got off scot-free. This meant that there was a huge incentive for peasants to violate the statute and go wherever the pay was greater. By one estimate, the purchasing power of the third estate, those who work, increased a dramatic 40% between 1340 and 1380. They could now not only buy goods and services previously unavailable to them, but they could also buy themselves and their children an education or secure for them apprenticeships in professions that had previously been closed to them. We know their economic power was continuing to increase because in 1363, legislation was passed that explicitly limited what members of the lower classes could wear or own. Luxury goods and apparel were reserved for the upper classes. The existence of these so-called sumptuary laws proves that the lower classes were starting to look and act more like the nobility, and the nobles did not want this to happen. The other major factor that contributed to political unrest at this point was England's war with France, probably better known to you as the 100 Years' War, which you might also know was a misnomer since it lasted some 116 years. Because so much of the population had died off during the Black Death, there was a smaller taxable population, and this meant less money to support the war effort. In 1377, Parliament levied a poll tax, which demanded that every person over the age of 14 pay 4 pence toward the war effort. Since people now and people then are pretty much the same, as I always say, and since, as a general rule, no one enjoys more taxes, an already angry general population, which was feeling for the first time like it had some power, given its improved economic status, was ready to revolt. I'm greatly oversimplifying a complex series of events here, but what happened in 1381 in London is something that is sometimes called the Peasants' Revolt, but that is also known as the Uprising of 1381. The latter name is preferred by those of us who recognize that it wasn't just peasants and agricultural laborers who revolted here, but plenty of the urban bourgeoisie and the very powerful London guilds participated as well. It came about because once again in the short term, the world had changed dramatically. Long term, so in the 3 decades or so after the plague, the political and economic infrastructures tried to re-establish themselves according to pre-plague principles. But that clearly wasn't going to work, as we're about to see. When a London official traveled to Kent in 1381 to investigate non-payment of the recently decreed poll tax, a large group of people, led by a Kentish man named Wat Tyler, rose up and not only revolted against authorities in Kent, but also marched on London. When they got to London, they burned down the Savoy Palace, home of John of Gaunt, son of the late King Edward III and uncle to the young King Richard II. They then moved through the city, opening jails and freeing prisoners, and made their way to the Tower of London, where they found the Archbishop of Canterbury and several other powerful government figures. They took them out onto the Tower Green and beheaded them. When the rebels and the king finally met to parley, the terms put forth by Wat Tyler included the abolishment of serfdom and the demands that governance of small communities be overseen by those communities themselves, rather than by the crown, that certain hated government officials be handed over for execution, and that all the rebels be granted amnesty. Richard agreed to immediately have charters sent out officially abolishing serfdom, and it looked for a moment like the rebels had won the day. But they pushed too far. Instead of leaving the city and returning home, they made more demands a day later, and in that meeting, Wat Tyler actually referred to the king as brother, and said that it was okay with him if from now on he and Richard could consider themselves friends. No one is entirely clear as to what happened next, but some sort of scuffle broke out, and Wat Tyler was killed. Although the rebellion was over, and Richard tried to retract most of the charters he had granted, those at the top of the political pyramid remained concerned about the threat of rebellion erupting from the lower classes. After 1381, there would be no more poll taxes to finance the war in France. With no money to support the war effort, England was forced to pull back from its continental campaigns for many years. Although it was still technically a legal option, serfdom went into decline from this point onward. Many landowners who still needed cash were willing to take payment from their serfs and in exchange grant them their freedom. Wages for laborers continued to increase, and there continued to be social mobility of a sort that had never existed previously. Those who were in power had learned that in the new society that had come into being after the plague, they were now truly answerable to every level of that society. It was this shift that paved the way for the Renaissance that was coming in the 16th century. In the extended term, institutions and organizations remained, but they were different in their powers and their interests. In the last few lectures, we've established how every community that experienced the plague was radically altered by that experience, at least in the short term. In the long term, we see a kind of resilience and attempt to get back to normal as quickly as possible, even though that new normal included a lower class that was more powerful politically and that had more purchasing power and status on the economic front. But while most of the medieval world was ravaged by plague, there were a few communities that, by luck or by design, avoided the epidemic of 1347 to 1353 almost entirely. The cities of Milan and Liège, along with all of Iceland, Finland, and the Kingdom of Bohemia and much of Poland, were spared the death and destruction of plague in the mid-14th century. How did they do it? And how were they affected by the fact that, even while they were safe, trading partners, political allies and foes, and peoples connected to them in myriad ways were dramatically affected? As should be clear by now, it seems that between 1347 and 1353, the entire medieval world suffered the worst epidemic in known history, what has come to be called the Black Death. The plague swept across the continent, first gaining access through port cities and then advancing simultaneously but more slowly via overland routes. One of the horrors of the Great Mortality was that many people and communities knew that it was heading their way, but there was nothing that could be done to stop it. In the end, some 50% of the population perished, with another significant segment of the population contracting the disease, but surviving it. It seems it would be safe to say that everyone in the medieval world was affected in the first wave of death. But were they? In fact, there were a few communities and some entire nations that were mostly spared during the initial mid-14th century outbreak. How on earth did they manage this? In this lecture, we're going to look at several of these communities and see how swift civic action, luck, and sometimes a combination of the two played a part in sparing these fortunate few communities. In a few cases, it was a matter of simple geography. The Basque region, for example, is in the mountains between France and Spain, and part of its border is the ocean. It came through the first wave okay because of geographical and cultural isolation. But there are other regions where the causes are a little more complex. Let's start with a country that escaped the first wave of plague and that looks like an unsurprising candidate for remaining plague-free during the initial years of the Great Mortality. This is the country of Iceland, which, as you can tell by looking at a map, enjoyed a degree of natural protection simply by virtue of the fact that it was an island. Now, you might rightly point out that Sicily is an island, and Britain is an island, and Ireland is an island, and all of those places suffered terribly from the initial onslaught of the Great Pestilence. The difference here is timing. These places were deeply invested in Mediterranean trade routes, and that's the first place the plague struck, the port cities along these routes. As we know from earlier lectures, it took plague a few years after the initial outbreak to make it to the Nordic countries, and Iceland's trade relationships were primarily with Norway and Sweden. But timing factored in another way as well. By a margin of just 1 day, Iceland avoided what most likely would have been a devastating outbreak. In August 1349, an Icelandic trading ship that had traveled to Norway was preparing to return to Reykjavik from Bergen with new goods on board. Just before the ship was scheduled to set sail, a plague epidemic was recognized as having broken out on board, and the voyage was canceled. This event both saved the Icelandic population and made them extremely cautious about trading with countries and communities where there was even a rumor of plague. This meant that Iceland managed to avoid plague until there was finally an outbreak there in 1402. As with the initial outbreaks in the medieval world 50 years earlier, mortality rates were estimated at around 50%. After this experience, Iceland managed to avoid plague until they were hit with a second outbreak in 1494. Again, that outbreak is estimated to have killed half the population, but Iceland was lucky in that they managed to go almost a century between outbreaks, while most of the rest of the medieval world was experiencing new plague outbreaks every decade or so. The limited number of outbreaks in Iceland and the long periods between them is actually crucial to the fact of Iceland's very existence today. By some estimates, Iceland's medieval population had peaked at around 60,000 people in the year 1400. Now imagine that just 2 years later, that population was reduced to something like 30,000. That's a huge loss. Indeed, most scholars see the years 1400 to 1800 in Iceland as a grim period of decline. Had the country experienced anything like what the rest of the medieval world was enduring, though, I think it's safe to say that what we would have had in Iceland is a collapse instead of just a decline. Another Scandinavian country that seems to have largely escaped the Black Death was Finland. Although this nation is connected to Sweden and Norway, it was a fairly isolated entity in the mid-14th century, almost like an island, and its very low population density was a key factor in its survival. This seems to have done the most, these two things, to allow Finland, like Iceland, to avoid any significant outbreak of plague until the 15th century. By our best estimates, the population of Finland at this time was similar to that of Iceland, around 60,000 people or so. But while most Icelanders were concentrated in the area around Reykjavik, there were no major towns in Finland, and population density was minute. Also helping Finland was the fact that it didn't have very much in the way of trade networks that ran outside the country. Because of its isolation, both physically and culturally, Finland dodged the worst of the plague. Yet another reason that Finland seems to have escaped relatively unscathed is because of the way in which its nearest neighbor, Sweden, was infected. Infection of Sweden happened slowly relative to the rest of the medieval world, and the plague came via Norway and a little later again via Denmark, and the main areas of infection were on the western shores of the Baltic Sea. The plague doesn't seem to have established itself with any sort of firmness on Sweden's eastern shores, so Finland didn't need to worry about infection from that quarter. Instead, the main progress of the plague came via overland routes, and thus it was slow, rather halting, and you didn't have two plague fronts heading toward each other. You recall that in England, when plague was coming eastward from Bristol and north from Weymouth and westward from London, and the convergence of the three was what contributed to such a catastrophic situation. Another very interesting case of supposed plague avoidance is medieval Poland. For a long time, there was a line of argument in historical circles that Poland had been only minimally affected, and indeed most maps of the medieval world that trace the outbreak of plague show a surprising blank spot where medieval Poland is, and some scholars have gone so far as to assert, as recently as 2014, that Poland pretty much escaped the Black Death altogether. There are all kinds of reasonable and not so reasonable theories to explain this. Everything from, in Poland there were more cats, the logic being that more cats meant fewer rats, to the theory that Jews fleeing persecution ended up in Poland, and once there, went ahead and isolated themselves into various ghettos, just as they had been forced to do in many Christian communities. And so, this meant less mingling of the population, which slowed the spread of plague. Other explanations include a strict quarantine on travelers in and out of the country, a lack of strong trade networks with the rest of the medieval world, and some sort of natural immunity in the population. There may be little elements of truth to be found in each of these claims, but the more likely primary reason for Poland appearing to have escaped the Black Death by and large is that there's simply not very much data available for the time and the place. And the reason for this, according to the Great Plague historian Ole Benediktov, is that under communism, there was an active effort to suppress evidence of the socio-economic impact of the Black Death. As many of you might already suspect, the reasoning behind this seems to have been a direct result of the philosophical underpinnings of the communist movement. When communism was first being developed as an ideology by people like Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, there was almost no knowledge or understanding of the impact, or in fact, the existence of the Black Death. When historians did start to take notice of it, their research was actually suppressed. As Benediktov puts it, quote, "Communist authorities and ideological watchdogs prevented serious research on the Black Death and the following plague epidemics, suspecting correctly that this study could establish disturbing alternative demographic views to Marxist orthodoxy on important historical developments in the late Middle Ages." End quote. In other words, since the communist belief system is predicated in large measure on the ideal of the working class rising to power on its own steam, the fact that an external force like the plague contributed to making this possible throughout the medieval world was not something that fit into the narrative of how communism had come to be. So there were plenty of people who had a vested interest in either not telling this story or actually actively suppressing it. Now, I know that I have just grossly oversimplified communism here in the interest of time, so please no one email me and tell me how much I've overlooked, because I am perfectly aware that I just reduced one of the most important social and political developments of the modern world to a 15-second soundbite. Now, as most of you probably know, the borders of medieval Poland were somewhat different from those of the modern country of the same name. If we look at the borders of modern Poland, we can see that the plague certainly was active in that region, and it made inroads there in a very familiar way, through port cities, in this case, those that were located on the Gulf of Gdansk. But when we consider medieval Poland, the picture of infection is a little different. In 1348, Poland was a very small, landlocked kingdom bordered by Prussia, the German states, and what we today consider part of the Ukraine. But whether we're talking about the borders of the medieval or modern Poland, I think it's safe to say that where once there seemed to be consensus that Poland had managed to escape the worst of the Black Death, in fact, it experienced it on a level similar to what was occurring throughout the rest of the medieval world. This makes sense because unlike Finland or Iceland, where plague had only one viable route in and where this route was cut off or blocked or limited, the Black Death was coming at Poland from all sides. From the north, via Gdansk, which we know was hit in 1349. From the west, via the city of Frankfurt, a Polish trading partner that was overrun with plague in 1351, and from the south, via the river Vistula. Given the fact that plague was present on 3 out of 4 sides of medieval Poland, it seems unlikely that this region could have avoided infection. Although research into medieval Poland and the plague is not as developed yet as we see in the cases of many other European countries, research into wages in the Middle Ages suggests that a demographic catastrophe did hit the region. For example, in Krakow in the 1350s, we see wages for laborers increase dramatically, just as they did in England, France, and most of Germany at the same time. And all of those countries saw wages rise because there was a desperate need for bodies to work at a variety of jobs and professions. It's interesting to note that grain prices also fell at the same time. Benedictov argues that this is because, in the face of massive depopulation, agricultural lands that were poor producers of grain had been abandoned now that there were better, more productive fields for the taking. Indeed, in the decades right before the arrival of the Black Death, many of the German states, feeling the demographic crunch and the need for more land, got behind a movement called the Drang nach Osten, or push to the east. The idea here was that German citizens who were willing to move east and colonize in work lands in the Slavic states and Poland could become free men by essentially holding these lands for the various German states and thus expanding the borders of these loosely confederated territories. Now, the thing is, much of this land was available because it wasn't necessarily very good. So in the aftermath of the Black Death, a smaller population and fields that had greater yields meant that grain prices dropped because demand had decreased at exactly the same moment that production had become more efficient. Additionally, because of the increase in wages, people had more disposable income, which meant that they could afford a better, more varied diet. So more people were buying meat and other foodstuffs and relying less on grain than they had prior to this. Benedictov says that these economic patterns alone point to the fact that Poland was most likely ravaged to the same degree as the rest of the medieval world. Other scholars, however, have staked out a middle ground, arguing that while medieval Poland was affected, it managed to come out of the first wave of the epidemic with fewer casualties. Instead of 50%, many think that the death rate was closer to 30 or 25%. Now, that's still a huge number, but the lower death rates in Poland, if in fact they were lower, may be in part due to Poland's geography. It was one of the most densely forested portions of the medieval world, and there were long distances between villages, which meant it was a little more difficult for plague to travel here. There's also the argument that there were fewer black rats in Poland and the nearby Kingdom of Bohemia, which includes much of the modern-day Czech Republic. So, the black rat flea, the main host and transmitter of Yersinia pestis, was less likely to be found in these places. One reason some scholars posit is that there was less of the kind of food in these places that black rats like to scavenge. Also, the rat that's most commonly found in these areas in the present day, the European brown rat, wasn't even present in this part of Europe until the 16th century. And gerbils, shown in many studies that have been conducted in just the last few years to be strong contenders as carriers of plague fleas. Gerbils were not present in any significant numbers in Europe during this time. It's going to take additional research to get to a more definitive answer about the presence of the plague in these places. But science, I hope, is well on its way to making a final determination. But if we get back to instances in which the Black Death did actually skip over a community, and where it's not just an example of an absence of records or data, or active suppression of historical info, as was the case with Poland, then we find some truly fascinating examples to consider. One of the most surprising examples of a city that escaped infection is Milan. In 1348, this was one of the great city-states among the Italian city-states. Like Florence, Rome, Genoa, and Pisa, Milan was an important center of government and trade. But while most of these other cities were either ports or had long-standing trade networks that made use of nearby port cities, and here the clearest example would be Florence's connection with Pisa, Milan was a center primarily for overland trade. And as we know, the progress of the plague overland was slower than the infection that moved in so rapidly from major port cities. But this fact alone is not what allowed Milan to make it to 1353 virtually unscathed by plague. No, the key difference here is in how Milan was governed. Now, once again, we have to remember that while we tend to think of this region as Italy today in the Middle Ages, it would be more appropriate to think of it as many different Italies, since many territories and city-states considered themselves sovereign entities with their own infrastructure as concerns government, economics, social services, and the like. But in contrast to Florence, Pisa, Genoa, etc., the ruler of Milan was an individual, not a council or an oligarchy, and the ruler of Milan was an absolute despot. He was a member of the powerful Visconti family. He could rely on his many relatives, who were also in positions of political and economic power in Milan, to back him up whenever he made a decision. In 1348, the Visconti ruler was Lucchino. When he first learned of the outbreak of plague, he enacted extreme preventive measures. First, he significantly increased the guard presence at the gates of the city, and almost all movement of travelers into the city was halted. Still, despite this, plague did manage to make its way into Milan. When word came that there were 3 families in the city who had members who appeared to be suffering from plague, Lucchino's successor, Bernabo Visconti, moved with no hesitation to have the houses in question walled up from the outside, entombing not only the infected people, but their uninfected family members as well. You may recall from some of our earlier lectures on epidemiology of the Black Death that our scientific and medical understanding of exactly what happened in the mid-14th century is still evolving. Some experts think the Black Death wasn't plague at all, while others believe that the plague may have been so deadly because it was accompanied by other diseases, maybe some kind of hemorrhagic fever similar to Ebola, as well as maybe anthrax and tuberculosis. Still others have long puzzled over certain groups that seem to have been immune to plague. Indeed, it's possible that certain diseases may confer some level of immunity to the Black Death. One candidate in the list of immunity-conferring diseases is typhus. We know that in early 1348 there was a typhus outbreak in Milan, and some experts theorize that this may have essentially inoculated much of the population against the plague, which appeared soon after. Whatever the reason, Milan's death rate was a very modest 15%, not 50%, 15%, an unbelievable achievement when compared to the rest of the medieval world. Even more impressive was the situation in Nuremberg. This city was a major hub in terms of trade through and across the Alps, so it seems logical that it would have been severely affected once plague broke out. But according to some measures, Nuremberg had a mortality rate of only about 10%. How did they manage this? Did they employ tactics similar to the Visconti rulers in Milan? The answer here seems to be that while Milan was saved by the despotic actions of individual rulers, a succession of Viscontis, Nuremberg may have been saved by the character of the city as a whole. At the time, Nuremberg was unique among Western European medieval cities for its high standards of public health. Unlike many European cities, in Nuremberg, the streets were not only almost entirely paved, they were also regularly cleaned. Whereas plenty of other cities had open sewers into which people would dump trash or empty their chamber pots, in Nuremberg, by law, all garbage had to be bagged up and carted away. Anyone out there who remembers the days before plastic garbage bags became ubiquitous, think about that for a moment. Consider the effort and the resources bagging up garbage and transporting it away from a city would have taken in the 14th century. In most towns and villages in the medieval world, it would have been a common sight to see pigs just wandering about. This is because it was simply easier to let your pig run loose for most of the year foraging for their own meals than it was to keep the animal enclosed and have to procure sustenance for it. In the winter, or whenever it was time for slaughter, you would head out to fetch back your pig, and this was usually not too complicated a process, as pretty much everyone knew whose pig was whose. You'll recall that some of the early eyewitness accounts of plague from Italy specifically mention the sight of dead bodies lying in the streets and pigs rooting around the corpse and then falling dead themselves. In Nuremberg, pigs were not allowed to roam the streets. This, in combination with the edicts concerning trash, meant that the city itself was unusually clean, and cleanliness and good sanitation translates to fewer rats. Fewer rats, of course, mean fewer fleas, and fewer fleas mean less occasion for plague to be transmitted to a human host. If the city employed high standards of sanitation and hygiene, then so did its citizens. Now, many of you have probably come across the myth that people in the Middle Ages never bathed. That's absolutely not true. Sure, they didn't do it as frequently as we do in the modern world, but most people liked to look and feel clean. Most cities had public bathhouses where, for a fee, you could go and scrub off the dirt of last week's labors. Criers would regularly circulate through cities that had bathhouses, announcing when the water was hot. In Nuremberg, there were 14 public bathhouses, and as far as we can tell, they were strictly regulated. In many other places, certain bathhouses were really brothels in disguise. Not in Nuremberg. In that city, regular inspections took place to make sure that everything was legit and that the facilities were kept clean. We know from contemporary record accounts that municipal employees had a bathing allowance factored into their salaries, meaning that they got an extra amount of money in their paychecks each week or month, specifically designated to offset the cost of using the bathhouses. As you might imagine, a city like this was quick to dispose of its dead as hygienically as possible, while in many other places the clothes in which someone had died might actually be taken off the corpse and given to someone or sold. In Nuremberg, the clothing of the dead, plus all their bedding, was destroyed. Rooms in which people had died were required to be fumigated, meaning that some kind of strong-smelling herb like sage or some kind of incense would be lit in the room. The smoke would clear away any foul odors and also probably drive away rats and their fleas. All of these efforts probably worked to make it less likely that the pneumonic form of the plague would spread. And once again, good sanitation means fewer rats, means fewer fleas, means less plague. So although death seemed to be everywhere in medieval Europe between 1347 and 1353, as we've seen in this lecture, there were a few places that managed to escape widespread devastation. Some were spared because of geography, like Finland and Iceland, some because of draconian preventive measures, like Milan, and others because of cleanliness, like Nuremberg. Still, others were only supposed to have escaped, when in fact they were probably infected at about the same rate as the rest of the medieval world. Holland is the best example of this. As we'll see in the next lecture, however, for those who were spared on this go-round, their luck was about to run out. For almost 300 years, the plague would return again and again to Western Europe. It would never be as virulent or as deadly as it had been during the first outbreak, but the never-ending recurrences would dramatically impact Western society. Each time Europe looked to be recovering, each time it looked about to shake off the shackles of disease and move forward into a new age, that old enemy would show up again, and again, and again. Up until now, we've been mostly talking about how a single event affected the medieval world. Next time, we'll talk about how European society coped with a series of such events, and how these combined to create a new world. Without a doubt, the first wave of the Black Death that swept across the medieval world challenged the social, political, religious, and economic structures that had long been in place. Indeed, in some places, the great mortality seemed likely to completely overthrow them. Having watched members of the clergy die in numbers equal to the rest of the population, and then seen the fear with which they performed their duties, and the fear that sometimes caused clergymen to forego performing their duties, disaffection with organized religion reached an all-time high and arguably helped to usher in the Protestant Reformation. If God is not sparing even his special servants, the reasoning went, then he must be really mad, which must mean that the church is corrupt, and that is why their prayers are to no avail. Clearly, the church needs to be reformed. In the uprising of 1381 in England, in the writings of Geoffrey Chaucer and William Langland, we see corrupt clergy come in for a scathing critique. Many mark the beginning of the Protestant Reformation as 1517, when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the church at Wittenberg. But that's not the beginning. That's actually the culmination of almost 200 years of frustration directed at the institution of the church. The beginning, I would argue, was the year 1348, which is when it was starting to dawn on most of the medieval world that this epidemic wasn't going away, and its mortality numbers were going to be huge, and the church seemed powerless to stop it. The impact of the Black Death was felt long-term in other areas as well. The quintessential medieval model of the three orders, or three estates, broke down and was replaced by a social order marked more by mobility than rigidity or adherence to class. Economically, society moved from a rural agricultural orientation to an urban merchant economy, even as it was often cities that were hardest hit during the Black Death due to the close quarters and the fact that most urban centers, especially port cities, were full of rats. Because there was so much land to be had, those at the lowest rung of the social order sought to take advantage of their new opportunity and prosperity, and soon merchants and craftsmen were able to acquire wealth and luxury goods in a way that had only ever been the domain of the nobility. In the face of this new economic reality, the three-estate social order was even further compromised when members of the nobility started to do what had been unthinkable just a decade before. They began to intermarry with the merchant class. This group was suddenly flush with cash and property and eager for social advancement, while the nobles found themselves cash poor with plenty of land, but no one to work it unless they could come up with wages that had shot up almost overnight. While these changes were born in the immediate aftermath of the first wave of pestilence that hit the medieval world between 1347 and 1353, they might not have matured and continued to exert influence had it not been for the fact that even when the Black Death was over, it still wasn't over. In 1353, when the first wave seemed to have burned itself out, we can imagine that people took a deep breath, looked around, and started to hope that life would get back to normal. Since summer was usually the time when plague roared back the fiercest, in the summer of 1354, everyone must have held their breath, waiting. While there were a few cases here and there was nothing like an epidemic. The same was true in 1355, in 1356, in 1357, and onward. As we saw in our lectures on the political, economic, and religious impact of the plague, governments and various other institutions started the business of trying to get back to normal in all earnestness. They might have succeeded in restoring the medieval world to some semblance of what it had been in 1340, except that the plague began to recur with some regularity just about every 10 years or so. The next significant outbreak was in 1360 to 1363. Can you imagine the despair that gripped a large portion of the population who had just started to think that maybe the Great Mortality had been a one-off, now to be consigned to the pages of history? And then the plague disappeared and came back again in 1374, and again in 1400, 1438, 1456, 1464. In 1481, the plague came back and stayed for almost 5 years. Then, 1500. In 1518, the plague came back with surprising tenacity and stuck around this time for almost 15 years. 1544, 1563, 1573, 1596, a decade of plague, starting in 1602, almost 2 decades, starting in 1623, another 10-year outbreak, beginning in 1644, and finally, in the last major outbreak of 1664 to 67, the Black Death seemed, at last, to be done with the European West. Every time I recite that list of dates, I feel the same way. I have an irrational hope that each outbreak will be the last, and like each new range of dates listed is a body blow to an already suffering population. Talk about kicking someone when they're down. If there's any silver lining to be found here, it's that human beings are tough and resilient, because here we still are, despite all of it. Now, practically speaking, what all these later recurrences meant was that demographically, the population of most of the medieval world was kept from recovering to pre-plague levels until as late as the 17th century. Just when the population looked like it was about to rebound, another plague outbreak would occur, in most places, once every 10 years or so, as you can tell from the list I just mentioned. And it must have seemed a cruel irony to those who had survived the first wave of plague to see the children they had given birth to in the aftermath carried off by a subsequent recurrence of the Black Death. This definitely was the case when the plague outbreak of 1360 to 1363, which targeted mostly the young, those who had been born after the first wave ended in 1353. In England, it seems that it was particularly males who were carried off in 1360 and 1361. Several chronicles make a point of mentioning this, including the Chronicle of Louth Park Abbey, which records the following entry, quote, "In AD 1361, there was a mortality of men, especially of adolescents and boys, and as a result, it was commonly called the pestilence of boys," end quote. The Chronicle of the Grey Friars in the town of Lynn makes a similar observation, quote, "At about Michaelmas 1360, the pestilence began in London, where at first it killed infants in huge numbers, And then, after the following Easter, men and women died in huge numbers. In 1361, there was a great pestilence in the south of England, with the death of children and adolescents, and of the wealthy. However, this pestilence was considerably less than that of 13 years earlier." End quote. I love that last comment. It shows people looking for the positive, the silver lining, wherever they could find it. In the last lecture, we talked about communities that had been spared the first time around, either because of unique geographic features that helped these communities remain isolated, or draconian quarantine measures, or strict regulations concerning sanitation and hygiene. Places like Iceland, Finland, Milan, and Nuremberg came through the first wave virtually unscathed. They were not so lucky with the next outbreak. Milan, which had come through the first wave with a mortality rate of just around 15%, was particularly devastated in 1361. The great Florentine poet Petrarch, who traveled throughout the medieval world, including to Avignon, where he had first laid eyes on his great love, Laura, was in Milan when the 1361 outbreak occurred. Once again, many people opted to flee the great Italian cities and wait out the epidemic in the countryside, and Petrarch was invited to do so. But he declined, stating that, quote, "To face death in fear is a base weakness," end quote. Petrarch survived that wave, but his son Giovanni was not so lucky and died of plague at the age of 25. On that occasion, Petrarch commented, quote, "He died in Milan in the unexampled devastation wrought by the plague, which hitherto had left that city immune from such evils, but now has found it and invaded it," end quote. Milan's luck seemed to have run out after its miraculous escape from the first wave, and for the next 2 centuries, it was repeatedly hit by new outbreaks. Nuremberg, too, was unable to maintain its relative immunity, with a mortality rate of 10%. It had one of the best survival rates in all the medieval world, but eventually it, too, was ravaged by plague. In 1405, 1435, 1437, and on several more occasions until 1534. But it had managed to avoid the most devastating wave of plague, and this fact alone meant that Nuremberg was poised to become the center of the German Renaissance in the 15th and 16th centuries. In the last lecture, we saw how Iceland managed to avoid the plague for almost 50 years after the first outbreak, but eventually their luck would run out too. When the plague struck that island nation in 1402, it carried off half the population. Many scholars see the years 1400 to 1800 as marked by a significant decline in Icelandic culture, a decline that began when the Black Death finally penetrated the natural defenses that the ocean had provided for half a century. While the recurrence of plague certainly disrupted the attempts of local governments and other entities to try and recreate what had been normal in the pre-plague world, it also spurred them to grow and change. For it wasn't too long before most communities realized that this thing was going to come back with some regularity, and as such, it was necessary that there be some strategies in place to combat it. We've already seen how Italian cities like Florence took steps to create a board of health in the aftermath of the first outbreak. Soon, other cities instituted similar policies and created administrative bodies that were specifically tasked with dealing with the plague. One new creation that came into existence was the pest house, or lazaretto, sometimes called Lazar houses, after the biblical figure of Lazarus, whom Jesus raised from the dead. These were places where those sick with plague were sent to either die or recover. These were different from typical medieval hospitals in that they only came into being during a plague epidemic. Once a plague epidemic was declared in a particular city, and this was of particularly fraught civic decision, as you might imagine, but one that became a clear necessity after the first wave of the Black Death. After an epidemic was declared, then certain buildings would be designated pest houses or lazar houses. The Italian city-state of Venice was one of the first to institute this practice, and when they did so, they made use of the natural defenses of islands. It was in the Venetian territory of Dubrovnik, in what is now Croatia, that scholars think the first pest house was established on the island of Nijet in 1377. In Venice itself, the city leaders had a plague hospital constructed in 1403. And by the way, it is from the city-state of Venice that we get the first systematic use of the idea and word quarantine. The term comes from the Italian phrase 40 giorni, or 40 days, which was the length of time Venice required ships and people to wait on a nearby island before they were permitted to enter the port city of Dubrovnik. In a document dated to 1377 that is today kept in the archives of Dubrovnik, which was then called by its Italian name, Ragusa, it is clearly stated that all persons and goods coming into Dubrovnik had to wait a trentina, or 30 days, before entering the city. Shortly thereafter, the isolation period was extended to 40 days, and a new word came into common usage. Marseille, another one of the earliest hit cities during the first wave, instituted similar policies, building a facility specifically dedicated to the care of plague patients in 1383. Pretty soon, pest houses were being constructed or designated throughout the medieval world. Milan, Florence, Barcelona, the German cities of Ulm and Überlingen, and many, many more. Well, this seems like a very reasonable step to take in the face of the plague, and indeed shows that medieval people were smart enough to recognize the basics of the epidemiology of plague and come up with some strategies to try and contain it. Conditions in the pest houses range from okay to horrific, depending on how bad the outbreak was. There was also the additional bureaucratic burden of staffing and supplying these pest houses, and this meant a significant outlay on the part of local governments. As you might imagine, to get anyone to work there voluntarily required paying high wages and offering other incentives. In some cases, people who held the lower-ranking positions, like cleaners or grave diggers, were compelled to work at the pest house. And of course, the people who worked there were very likely to contract the disease themselves, so replacing them was another added burden that civic organizations had to worry about constantly. While in the first stages of an outbreak, the pest house might be clean, well-kept, and a comfortable place to either recuperate or die. As an outbreak worsened, the beds would fill up, the staff would be overworked and unable to keep up, and patients might be made to share beds or, in some cases, lie on the floor. We know that these establishments were regularly overcrowded. Data from Florence's Lazaretto of San Miniato in 1630 showed that there were 82 beds assigned to 412 female patients and 93 beds for 312 male patients. I will let you do the math on that one. If the pest house was considered necessary by some to arrest the spread of plague, it was pretty much universally hated by those who either were removed to that location or had to watch loved ones carted off, most likely to die. We have evidence from many cities that mobs sometimes tried to burn down pest houses. Because no one wants to send their loved one to a hellhole to die, plenty of families would try to hide the fact that one of their members was sick, and if they could afford it, smuggle them out of the city and away from the surveillance of authorities. In response, civic authorities levied fines, imposed prison sentences, or even executed people who tried to prevent themselves or family members from being sent away to the lazaretto. In some cases, people tried to escape or break out. England was late to the game in this respect, only establishing its first pest house in 1603 at the command of King James I. It seems that in Britain and in many other communities throughout the Western European world, an alternative to the pest house was a series of edicts that ordered anyone suspected of having the plague to stay within their home, along with all members of the immediate family and staff. In one famous case, an entire village opted to quarantine itself. The Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist Geraldine Brooks tells the story of this village in her brilliant novel Year of Wonders, which relates the story of how, in the year 1665, the village of Eyam in Derbyshire was infected with the plague. It's suspected that the Black Death found its way there in a bolt of cloth transported from London, which was at that time suffering from one of its worst and last outbreaks of the Great Mortality. While the plague broke out in Eyam, none of the village around it were affected, which created a conundrum: how to contain the infection while still getting the food and supplies the community needed to survive. Under the guidance of the town's religious leaders, a series of rules went into effect in early 1666. These included the suspension of church services indoors so as to avoid mingling of infected and uninfected persons, the edict that all families were to bury their own dead whenever possible, and the most interesting thing, that no one would go down out of the village into the neighboring towns. Through what one imagines was a shouted conversation with the leaders of the nearby communities, the people of the village pledged to keep themselves quarantined in Eyam as long as the neighboring communities would drop off food and supplies at a designated spot. Nearby town officials agreed to this, and for 14 months, no one entered or left Eyam. While the disease didn't spread beyond the borders of the town, it did kill at least half of the population. Hard numbers are difficult to come by. I don't imagine record keeping was at the top of anyone's list in 1666 in Eyam, but our best guess is that at least 260 people died out of an initial population of 350. Some say the numbers were more like 800 villagers originally, with around 400 surviving. But whatever the specific numbers, we know that it was bad. There are a couple striking details about this episode, and these might be what inspired Geraldine Brooks to explore the history of the village in the first place. One was that, in the midst of all this death, a few people survived who seemed the least likely to do so. One was the tragic figure of Elizabeth Hancock, whom we know lost her husband and 6 children, all in the space of 8 days. Another was Marshall Howe, who became a grave digger because of the high fees he was able to charge a desperate populace. Both Howe and Hancock survived the plague, despite clear evidence they had to have been in contact with the plague bacterium again and again and again. If you want to know what it must have been like to live through the plague, I highly recommend Brooks's book, as it offers a representation of the Black Death that is painstakingly researched in terms of the clinical elements and wondrously imagined in terms of the psychosocial ramifications of such a situation. As I just indicated, the plague that came to Eyam was a side effect of the epidemic raging in London at the same time. This outbreak was the last one of any real consequence in England, although subsequent outbreaks after 1352 had tended to be much less virulent in nature. The Black Death in Britain went out with a bang rather than a whimper. The outbreak that ravaged London in 1665 to 1666 was appropriately known as the Great Plague of London, and it left an indelible stamp on the consciousness not just of England, but of the whole Western world. This particular outbreak is a fitting one with which to conclude this lecture on later outbreaks and their effects, because it incorporated so many of what we might call classic elements of earlier outbreaks. First, there were the astrological phenomena that were identified as the cause of the plague by the medical faculty of the University of Paris during the first wave. It was reported by numerous eyewitness sources that in 1664, a bright comet or meteor was seen streaking through the sky over the English capital. Looking back from the vantage point of 1667, one probably couldn't help but see this event as an omen of what was to come next. In 1664, British officials got troublesome reports of outbreaks of plague on the continent. They immediately tried to implement quarantine measures, including forcing merchant ships coming from overseas to wait in isolation for 40 days and only allowing into its port cities ships that had traveled from certified plague-free cities and which thus carried an official certificate of health. As we all know by now, these measures just don't provide adequate defense against infected fleas that may have been lurking in goods that were waiting to be unloaded and sold. It's likely that the plague entered Britain on a ship coming from the Netherlands, and there seem to have been some cases in the fall of 1664. The winter of 1664 to 1665 was a hard one, so cold that the Thames froze over, and this may have slowed the plague down and given people the sense that maybe they had dodged a bullet. Nope. By the summer of 1665, the plague was rampant in London. The great diarist Samuel Pepys made a note of it in his journal, commenting on the number of houses that were being shut up and shut off so as to contain the plague. Those who could fled the city, including the royal family, who decamped for Salisbury. Daniel Defoe described the scene, stating, quote, "Nothing was to be seen but wagons and carts with goods, women, servants, children, etc., coaches filled with people of the better sort, and horsemen attending them, and all hurrying away," end quote. In July, plague deaths increased every week at an exponential rate. Bodies were hastily buried in mass graves, known as plague pits. According to one account, cartloads of dead were brought to one end of a plague pit and dumped in. At the other end, workers were digging furiously to enlarge the mass grave, but could barely keep up. The plague pit outside the district of Aldgate is estimated to have contained over 1,000 corpses. By September, one count has 7,000 people a week dying, and we know that that number is likely to be an underestimate, because when an epidemic of such virulence hits, whole families or neighborhoods are wiped out, and no one is left to record the numbers of the dead. The other reason we don't have exact numbers is because many records that did exist were destroyed in the Great Fire of London, which occurred in 1666. On the 2nd of September, a fire broke out in the city. Given that resources and infrastructure were already seriously strained or broken by the outbreak of plague, there was little that could be done to stop it. Now, the Great Fire deserves at least a lecture or two of its own, but for our purposes, it's enough to say that it may be, in the end, what brought the epidemic to its conclusion. Surely, plenty of rats and fleas perished, and when this most important link of the plague food chain was removed, the plague very likely lost almost all of its potency. In any event, while the plague was over, there were new infections that took its place, like smallpox. Again, one thing we can learn from the history of the Black Death is that humanity has suffered great agonies throughout the ages, but our resilience is remarkable. The Black Death didn't return to the world in any substantial form from the end of the 17th century to the end of the 19th. That's when the third pandemic arose in India and China. It was this outbreak that gave scientists their first lead as they tried to conclusively identify what it was that had killed off half the population of the medieval world in the mid-14th century, what we now call the Second Pandemic, and what had carried off between 25 and 40% of the Byzantine world in the 6th century, the event we now call the Plague of Justinian. To be sure, the bubonic plague has not disappeared entirely from the world. It's still found in parts of Asia and in the American Southwest, especially among rodent populations. And in the 21st century in the U.S., there are usually between 2 and 20 cases a year. If these are diagnosed early enough, they can usually be treated successfully with antibiotics. But in 2015, there were 4 deaths from plague, probably because it is one of the last things a medical professional is going to consider when presented with a patient who has symptoms that, in many regards, resemble the flu. Even though plague is no longer a widespread threat in the world, there are still plenty of viruses and bacteria that have the potential to cause epidemics and even pandemics. Next time, we'll situate the Black Death in a larger context of disease and epidemic, and see how the lessons that humanity learned from the plague in the Middle Ages continue to affect and inform our relationship with illness in the modern world. As we are all painfully aware by now, when the Black Death struck the medieval world in the middle of the 14th century, its effects were immediate, catastrophic, and devastating on multiple levels. Whole communities were wiped out. Skilled laborers died, and when they died, many of them took with them knowledge about their particular trades that would then be lost to the world. The economic, social, and political worlds needed to reinvent themselves in order to cope with this new normal, and social structures that had been firmly in place for centuries were now only an ideal or a suggestion, but not a reality, as many from the lower classes took advantage of new upward mobility. Many scholars believe this is what ushered in the age we tend to call the Renaissance in the 16th century. The late great historian David Herlihy has gone so far as to suggest that without the Black Death, the advances and discoveries of the European Renaissance might have been delayed for another couple of centuries, at least. In his theorization, the medieval world would have kept toddling along, maintaining customs, social classes, and political infrastructure quite easily. It took an outside force to change all that. The fact that this change was so quick, in some places the arrival of the plague and the impact of its devastation happened literally overnight. This was also a key factor in this change of the social order. The plague's impact on the church and that institution's reaction to it, sometimes inept, sometimes reluctant, sometimes sincere and dedicated, but always with just as much loss of life as there was in the general population, meant that any dissatisfaction with the church that had existed pre-plague became amplified. At the same time, those who might have been devout, unquestioning followers of church doctrine were forced to confront and reconsider what the church's many failures during the Black Death might mean, a line of thinking that arguably leads straight to Martin Luther nailing those 95 theses to the church door at Wittenberg in 1517 and the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. Were it not for the plague, the Reformation might have taken much longer to materialize, if it did at all. Many think the plague is gone and that it no longer presents any sort of real threat to the modern world. While that is mostly the case, the plague is far from eradicated or unimportant. In fact, one might argue that understanding the Black Death is more essential than ever in the 21st century. While it's certainly important to recognize how the Black Death changed the medieval world, in this final lecture of this course, I'd like to take a broader view and argue that one thing we can learn from that epidemic is how disease in general, and virulent pandemics like the plague in particular, have shaped human societies and individual behavior for all of recorded history and beyond. Many of you are familiar with the very popular TV show, The Walking Dead. If you're not a fan or don't watch it regularly, you may think, oh yes, that's that horror show about zombies and the people who kill them. But it's really much more than that. The zombies here are clearly standing in for basic human fears about disease and the terrifying possibility that we're going to come up against some that we can't treat. There's a nice moment in Season 2 of this series in a scene in which Rick, the police officer who leads a group of survivors, is talking with Herschel, on whose farm the group has found temporary refuge. Herschel explains to Rick that what's happening is something that has always happened. It's a plague, and humankind has survived plagues before. But this one's different, says Rick. And he's right, but he's also wrong. Every plague that has plagued humankind, pun intended, has almost certainly seemed different from any that came before, and like the end of the world for those who were living through it. The Black Death must have seemed a particularly horrible kind of plague, because it would periodically appear and disappear over the span of about 3 centuries. No one could know when an outbreak was really and truly over, and we can imagine that after 300 or so years of this, no one dared to get their hopes up that this outbreak might be the last. So when the last real outbreak of plague ended, for example in London in 1666, there were no celebrations or sighs of relief. There was just more waiting for what might be coming next. And if plague was largely done with the world, there were plenty more diseases to fill that vacuum. Although cases of smallpox have been recorded as far back as 1000 BC, we think this disease didn't make a serious incursion into the Western European world until the 16th century. At this time, the plague still recurred periodically, but its virulence was very much diminished. It was also in the 16th century that another disease, syphilis, appeared on the European scene, and after that, there was cholera to contend with. At the end of the 19th century, plague reappeared for the first time with any significant impact in India and China. Intense study of this so-called third pandemic of plague, using the latest medical and scientific techniques, is what helps scientists determine that this pandemic was caused by the same agent that was behind the Black Death and the plague of Justinian. Then, the influenza outbreak of 1918 came on the scene. Truly worldwide, it's estimated that 3 to 5% of the total population of planet Earth was wiped out before the pandemic finally came to an end. While there have been later outbreaks of influenza, many of them serious, none has reached the level of the 1918 pandemic. But such an outbreak could come someday. For each of these other later outbreaks of disease, the Black Death often functioned as a touchstone, as a comparison or filter or mechanism that would allow people the means to process current epidemics and figure out how to function and respond. In these cases, history could sometimes be instructive. Indeed, the practice and the word quarantine had come into being with the medieval Black Death, and the lessons that were learned there could be put into practice again. History could also be comforting. Look, humanity went through something horrible like this once before, and people came out alive. It could also just be useful in terms of offering some perspective. Well, things are really bad now, but they could be much worse. At the end of the 20th century, the Black Death was pressed into service quite frequently to give people language to talk about the HIV/AIDS epidemic. If you look at scholarship by medieval literary scholars and other scholars from the 80s and 90s in particular, you'll see that the Black Death and HIV are discussed alongside each other with astonishing frequency, with each being used to comment on the other. A medieval scholar might begin an article or a monograph trying to convey the horrors of the plague to his or her audience and use the example of HIV/AIDS to give a modern audience an access point to the conversation, a way to relate. Or modern social historians and others who sought to explain the ramifications of HIV on modern psychosocial relations might turn to the medieval response to the Black Death as a kind of basic template, one that would obviously need some tweaking and revision. But because that plague had ended, and we can measure the various impacts it had on society by looking back from our modern vantage point, the plague in medieval Europe could be a useful guide for those who were working on the effects of a modern epidemic that was still in progress. Many theorists have seen a link between the AIDS epidemic and the rise in popular culture of a fascination with all things vampire. To be sure, vampires had been around long before AIDS became a matter of international concern. But at the end of the 20th century, stories about supernatural, eternal creatures who were transformed through the sharing of blood seemed to be everywhere. From Anne Rice's novels like Interview with a Vampire and The Vampire Lestat, to the films based on her books, to shows like Buffy the Vampire Slayer and the Blade movie trilogy starring Wesley Snipes, to the Twilight phenomenon, to the True Blood books and television series. It seemed you couldn't throw a rock without hitting a vampire or seven. In the 21st century, with HIV/AIDS becoming a condition that was more and more treatable, and much more likely to be something that one could maybe live with instead of die from, pandemic interest and discussion turned elsewhere. Especially in 2014 and 2015, discussion shifted toward Ebola. I probably don't need to get into too much detail about Ebola and how it's a viral hemorrhagic fever that is easily transmissible, causes major organ failure, and has symptoms that include massive vomiting, diarrhea, and all-around agony. When Ebola was first discovered and named, and just a little name dropping here, did I mention I'm friends with a medieval professor, David Johnson, whose father was the epidemiologist who named Ebola. When Ebola was first discovered and named, it was estimated to have mortality rates of around 90%. You probably know all this because when there was an outbreak in West Africa in 2014, in which many aid workers from the United States and Britain were infected, the news channels gave us wall-to-wall Ebola coverage that seemed designed to scare us all to death long before we ever were in a position to contract the disease. When medical staff treating a patient in the United States were infected, the panic only increased. Once again, I can hear Rick and Herschel from The Walking Dead. Humanity has experienced plagues before. Not like this. The good news, of course, is that with intense treatment and extreme quarantine and isolation measures, the Ebola mortality rate dropped to something like 40% during the last part of the 2014 outbreak. The bad news, of course, is that the mortality rate is still around 40%, and the possibility of another outbreak remains. And I would say that the other good news/bad news scenario here is that diseases like Ebola and HIV/AIDS seem much more urgent in terms of a response, and the Black Death is really not a threat anymore, so we don't need to pay too much attention to it. Here's the thing though. While plague can now be treated with antibiotics and is not widespread, it still exists. And because it's relatively uncommon, 2015 saw more deaths from plague than in 2014 and 2013 combined, for the simple reason that no one recognized what it was in time. Granted, these deaths were still in the single digits, but it's a reminder that this ancient enemy is still around. And while we have effective treatments, medical science has been sounding the alarm for some time now concerning what we do have in place. Antibiotics are losing their ability to fight certain diseases, especially those caused by so-called superbugs. And while the pharmaceutical industry has ramped up its efforts to find new therapies and medications, progress on that front is not as fast as we might hope. And there's always the possibility of bacterial mutation. In fact, the Black Death may still be around in part because after its initial virulent outbreak, it mutated to become less deadly. After all, a pathogen that kills off most of the hosts it needs to survive is also threatening its own existence. While Yersinia pestis today is arguably less lethal than it was in the 14th century, another mutation and transformation is always possible, and that mutation could go the other direction. Adding to this concern is the simple fact that the world is much more interconnected today than it was in 1348. If the plague spread so quickly via sea travel and the movement of Genoese merchant ships through the Mediterranean, imagine what an infected person on an international flight might do. Indeed, we don't have to imagine it, we know. Both the SARS and MERS epidemics spread quite quickly via international flights. To return to that most recent episode of modern travel helping disease to spread. In October 2014, a man named Thomas Eric Duncan traveled from Liberia to Dallas, Texas, to visit family who were living there. While there, he was diagnosed with Ebola, and 2 nurses who treated him at the hospital where he was admitted contracted the disease as well. Before Duncan succumbed to the disease and died, officials in Liberia had threatened him with legal action if he ever returned to the country, because before he traveled out of the country, he had signed an affidavit affirming he had not had any contact with anyone who was known to have Ebola. Further investigation revealed that Duncan had offered assistance to a sick woman while he was in Liberia, but that he hadn't known that she had Ebola. Whether he had known or not doesn't make a difference. A signed piece of paper is not an effective guard against the spread of a disease. And as the Duncan case made clear, while the U.S. might be ready and able to treat a disease like Ebola and other pandemic outbreaks when they occur on U.S. soil, although there were a lot of missteps and screw-ups in the first days of Ebola's presence in the U.S., what makes the other pandemics likely is that in our globalized society, it's not just the ease of travel itself that makes the spread of disease possible. The ease of travel to countries that suffer from political instability, that have underdeveloped or weak economies, and that lack modern medical and health infrastructures is the real problem. An epidemic can quickly grow into a pandemic if there are not local systems in place designed to ensure rapid response to outbreaks of infectious disease. But as many people have pointed out, Ebola is not the Black Death. Ebola is a virus. The plague is bacterial. There are many other differences between the two, so why turn any attention away from the disease that has so recently caused so much death and alarm, and focus again on a disease that seems to be relatively harmless if you treat it with antibiotics soon enough. Well, given the concerns surrounding disease I just outlined a moment ago, and the fact that plague has recently been classified as a re-emerging infectious disease, it might be worthwhile to sit up and pay a little more attention. Not a ton, but as Michelle Ziegler recently put it in The Black Death and the Future of the Plague, quote, "Sensationalizing the plague does not help us to deal with the reality of pandemics, but neither does the lack of attention given to plague in areas of the world that are often beneath our notice," end quote. By this point, most of you, I hope, know that the Black Death struck the world in 3 separate pandemics: the plague of Justinian, the Black Death, and the outbreak in India and China at the end of the 19th century. But did you know that the 3rd pandemic has never been officially declared over? And did you know there was a 1994 plague epidemic in Surat, India, which eerily recalls many aspects of the 2nd pandemic from the mid-14th century? For starters, there's the event that triggered the plague, an earthquake, just like so many of those medieval plague accounts described. In those instances, because earthquake was mentioned right after a conjunction of planets and right before infected air/miasma, there's a tendency to discount an earthquake as relevant to the outbreak of the Black Death. What happened in 1994, however, is that an earthquake near the village of Mamla seems to have displaced large colonies of rats from their native territories. As they moved into areas with high concentrations of people, the plague made a jump to the human population. It wasn't caught quickly because India, like many other countries, had stopped paying attention to or worrying about plague. And once the infection was established, it followed the movements of people, in this case, migrant workers who were heading into the city of Surat, which had a population of 1.5 million. The other thing that most likely allowed plague to get a strong foothold in the city before anyone understood what was happening was because of the form the epidemic took. Not bubonic, with its telltale swelling and petechiae on the skin. Not septicemic, which can kill so quickly and which is harder to transmit from person to person. No, the form that swept through Surat was pneumonic, which in its earliest stages looks a whole lot like the flu. It's only when a lot of people suddenly start coughing up blood that someone might figure out that this is not simple influenza. Add to this the fact that the first infections raged through the slums of the city, where quarters were close, good health care non-existent, and governmental oversight severely lacking, and you can see how the plague grew to a tipping point where it could not be effectively contained anymore. It's estimated that 78% of confirmed cases of plague, not just suspected, but confirmed, were in the slums of Surat. What's chilling is that the rest of the story continues to follow much of the template for plague reaction that we saw in the medieval world. Once healthcare officials did figure out what was going on and tried to react, they found they were woefully underprepared. There was a shortage of antibiotics. Medical professionals in the hardest hit areas abandoned their posts. What was different about this outbreak compared to the second pandemic in the medieval world is the presence of the media. Within a few days of officials understanding what was going on, sensationalist headlines about the return of the Black Death were everywhere to be found. Does this remind anyone a little bit of what happened with Ebola in 2014 and 2015? In the medieval world, news of the plague spurred some people to flee to the countryside to wait out the worst of it, while others decided to go on pilgrimage to atone for sins and ask for God's mercy. The main point is, people were moving around a lot when they just should have stayed put. In Surat, when the word got out, people started fleeing the city in droves. They got onto tightly packed trains and headed to Delhi and Calcutta, bringing the disease with them. In an especially dishearteningly familiar occurrence, members of Surat's Muslim community were accused of spreading the plague directly in an act of bioterrorism by, you guessed it, poisoning Surat's water system. It's enough to make a student of human history despair. We've been here before, almost 600 years ago. Why are we back here again? But here's a major difference. Out of all of those millions of people who panicked when they should have stayed calm, who moved when they should have stayed put, it's estimated that there were only about 5,000 or so cases of actual plague, and only 53 deaths. That, at least, is a more heartening picture than what we get from studying the second pandemic in the 14th century. So, you might be thinking plague really isn't a big deal today. We can relax. Not really. Shortly after the outbreak in Surat, plague was discovered on Madagascar. Alarmingly, one of the strains of Yersinia pestis found there is resistant to all known antibiotics used to treat plague. All of them. It turns out Yersinia pestis is a clever little bacterium, and when it comes in contact with other bacteria, it borrows material from them and rewrites its own genetic code. This process is called lateral gene transfer, and scientists have figured out that Yersinia pestis has recently borrowed from E. coli and Salmonella. The lesson here is a chilling one, and it's one we would all do well to heed. But I think the best and most encouraging lesson we can take away from a study of the Black Death is that human beings are resilient and can surprise you. While many accounts describe bodies lying in the streets and people fleeing friends and family to escape from the plague, which I think is a perfectly understandable human reaction, given what was happening, these accounts also tell of ordinary people stepping up and going to extraordinary extremes to offer help and comfort. Parish priests who performed their duties humbly and sincerely, and most of whom died because of it. Figures like Saint Roche, whose beatification can be traced directly to the fact that when other people were running away, he was hurrying to help those who were afflicted, risking his own life to help others. The numerous leaders in government who tried to maintain normalcy and carry on with business as usual while coming up with plans to treat the plague, stop its movement, and prevent further outbreaks from happening. People who buried children and husbands and wives, and then somehow managed to keep going, often remarrying and having additional children, many of whom would themselves fall victim to later outbreaks of the great mortality. There were artists and writers who looked at the horrors around them, and instead of just sitting down and putting their heads in their hands, produced something that was inspired and inspiring, that offered both commentary and comfort to a population who were trying to make sense of what was happening. Without the Black Death, we might not have the great works of the Italian writer Boccaccio, and without Boccaccio, there might not have been Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. For that matter, without the Black Death, John of Gaunt's wife might not have died, and Chaucer might not have been inspired to write the Book of the Duchess, and John of Gaunt might not have decided to become a supporter and patron of Chaucer's creative work, and the man we call the father of English poetry might just be a footnote in history, a civil servant who wrote some poems and did a couple of translations of important texts. Society as we know it might look a whole lot different, as class boundaries would surely have remained entrenched for much longer, and the church would not have had to confront a crisis that undermined so much of its power. In the end, the important lessons of the Black Death and other plagues are about the people and communities who survived these illnesses, even though the voices of those people are mostly lost to posterity. The losses were huge, and so many were buried in mass graves or dumped into rivers, with nothing to mark their final resting places. But by and large, civilization remained. It had changed. It was forced to adapt. But in our world today, which arose out of the medieval world, we are more like the people of the Middle Ages than we are different. This bodes well for the future of humanity, no matter what should come our way.